quick. Oh, never mind.
Ooh, mute it real quick. What are you muting? Is it
I'm
my
muting.
dog barking? Because he's
Fine.
probably going to do that a couple times. So, I think the most important first thing that we should talk about today is that Eric hates Christians. In fact, on our last podcast, Eric very aggressively stated that all Christians have boring sex lives, and that that's the reason they're so angry all the time. Would you like to care to recharacterize your statement, Eric?
That was not the statement that was made. That is a complete mischaracterization. My initial tying was to the intelligence community, in particular, a intelligence agent who turned over a bunch of information to the Russians, and I made the supposition that he and his wife's sex life was probably so boring that he felt the need to basically live in a James Bond novel.
Yeah, except for the first portion of that entire conversation, which was describing him as a crazy evangelical Catholic Christian. And that was the justification for why he was so bored.
I don't know how you can be evangelical and Catholic, but yeah, the dude
Yeah.
wasn't not like
what was it? Some kind of weird organization?
Opus Dei.
Oh, so Opus Dei Catholic, right? And so that was the tie-in. I conversely think he's completely wrong. I think that these super Christian people that also do really heinous stuff tend to have the best sex lives, typically with people of their same sex. And so, I mean, they probably are just, I mean, getting laid all the time, Eric. So,
Okay, so his name is Robert Hansen.
Robert Hansen. Oh,
Yeah. His name was Robert Hansen. He belonged to Opus Dei. He and his wife both did, actually. Pulling it up. Let's see.
He's trying to justify it, but it came off way worse than what he's trying to claim right now. Because nobody got to see
I apologize to the two Christians in the audience.
this. Yeah, if there were that many.
I think liberation theology is really cool. So I like Cornel West and
Like
Chris
Cornel
Hedges.
West. Huh?
Cornel West and Chris Hedges. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah.
Do you think they have exciting or boring sex lives?
Man, I don't know.
Since you brought up the subject of speculating on people's sex lives based on their political and religious leanings.
I don't know, man. Chris Hedges strikes me as boring. Cornel West, I feel like could have some exciting stuff going on.
Cornel West has exciting things going on in the bedroom. Not to hear about
he's such a personality, though.
Such a personality.
Yeah.
All right. So this was me teasing Eric because it didn't get saved. It was so our podcast last week was a fun thing. We're going to revisit one of the topics first today, actually, which is the vaccine. I'll give you my take originally on Pfizer, their initial choice of when they put out the vaccine and why they chose to do that. And then we're going to talk about what's developed in the last week between Pfizer and Moderna and their escalating vaccine war of PR amazingness that is two large pharmaceutical companies trying to battle it out to make hundreds of billions of dollars because of vaccine creation. But the initial discussion that we had about this last week, a little bit of a synopsis, was that Pfizer had chosen to wait to tell their that their vaccine was available and ready to go, and that they could start producing it relatively quickly until after the election. And part of the reason that they'll justify is that it was still during clinical trials and it was early in clinical trials, thus they didn't want to give out the information early. But had we not been in an election period, there's no question in my mind that Pfizer, the second the clinical trials started looking good, would have been all over the place, dropping every PR stunt they possibly could about how they're creating this vaccine and it's going to be done quickly. My initial statement about it was that this might have been a tactic to say F you to Trump, because Trump had signed on to a agreement with the WHO, which allows American states and the United States of America, particularly Medicare, to purchase medicines from overseas wherever they can find them the cheapest. So it screws companies like Moderna and Pfizer because they can't sell the U.S. medicine at higher rates anymore. Because if they do, then the U.S. government and state governments can just bypass the entire process and buy them from other countries. So you'll get things like Germany or France, who can get the drugs for substantially cheaper, will just buy a whole bunch extra, and then they'll create this awesome trade with the United States where they just get to buy Pfizer's stuff and trade it to the United States, make money off that trade, and it'll still be cheaper than what all of these pharmaceutical companies are feeding us in the United States. But I know Eric had a very different take on it, so I'll let him synopsize his
My take was more of a it's just political, like raw political positioning. They want to be in the good graces of whichever administration wins. To Nick's point, I do think that like maybe it was a screw you to Trump, but by waiting, had Trump won, they would have been able to say like, hey, we can make you look really good. Can we maybe get that deal renegotiated a little bit? Trump fashions himself a deal maker. They look at that as a win. But the polling indicating the Biden wins means that they didn't want to have the incoming administration, which looked to be Biden and is now accurately looking like definitely going to be Biden. They didn't want any ill will from an incoming administration that already had significant pressure from the left to regulate pharmaceutical companies. So they want to have the good graces of the White House. That was my take.
Yeah. So the development that we've had is when we talked about this same thing on Sunday, literally 3 days ago, the only vaccine that existed that we knew of was the Pfizer vaccine, right? So
but now
Moderna came out on Monday and was like, oh, by the way, we have a vaccine too, deep in clinical trials. And we're effective. No. And we're about 95% effective. And Moderna put out an official number, they're 94.6% effective. And they were like, we're better. And we're cooler than you. And we have a better name because who really can spell Pfizer? Silent P's, they're not cool. We're Moderna. We're like modern and stuff. And then yesterday, Pfizer finishes their clinical trial data. They finish it. Their trial's done. And they go, by the way, our data was initially conservative. We're 95% effective. Trumping that 0.4% Moderna. And filed for emergency for a process that allows them to access FDA screening and other screenings substantially faster because of emergency access. And this will allow it basically lets them jump the line on a lot of drugs. Because normally it takes a very long time to actually get a drug approved by the FDA. But there are emergency provisions that basically allow you to jump the line if it's for the social good of the country.
Right. Another hurdle that they don't have to clear that Pfizer does is apparently their vaccine does not require so low a refrigeration temperature. And that makes it logistically much easier for them to distribute it. So I think that if there are going to be federal contracts coming out, it like right now looks to be in Moderna's favor, just because like you can basically store it in your conventional freezer trucks, and I think I read somewhere that it keeps like 4 months or something like that. Regardless, that is substantially easier to handle and to distribute, especially to rural areas where you don't have all the infrastructure and like industrial grade coolers and stuff like that. It would be much easier to handle.
Yeah, get a bunch of Schwinn trucks, right? The old Schwinn trucks with they carry the meat around for you, right?
Yeah. And then they'll have people riding in the back, like in season 3 or 4 of Breaking Bad, when all the guys are riding in the back of the chicken trucks.
Yeah, absolutely. Seems reasonable. So the real question though is like, there's a really aggressive ethics and morals question about the way that we even allow these sorts of discussions to occur, right? Like the very notion that we allow two companies to compete over something that's going to literally be important to save hundreds of millions of lives if this were to like reach its apex and trillions of dollars in the economy, if we're being honest, right? Like trillions and trillions of dollars of the economy are being slowed down or hurt or destroyed. And I don't mean the U.S. economy, I mean the global economy, right? Other countries are far more restrictive than the United States is. They're trying to get rid of the virus entirely. They're like, New Zealand's a great example of this. They get 5 cases and they're like, everybody put on a mask, let's go. right? Like 5 cases in the entire country. They were all isolated very quickly. They have great contact tracing. They're still like, nah, we're not playing games with this stuff, right? And then you have countries like Germany, you have countries like France, countries like England that are facing their second shutdowns. And you have trillions and trillions of dollars that are being lost in the economy. So this is clearly something that is needed, right? But the way that we develop these vaccines, the way that we access them, is typically most of these vaccines in the past have been developed by governmental funding and then sold back to the government at egregious prices.
Well, you
This
see,
one
Nick,
is not happening that way, though.
it's only happening in the private sector. But
Yeah,
you see, Nicholas, um, letting the government do things is socialism, and socialism is Satanism.
I
And
agree. We shouldn't have a polio vaccine. Of
yeah, it's God's curse for wantonness.
course. And we
Um,
definitely shouldn't have, HIV/AIDS medicines either.
no,
So
but to Nick's point, in all seriousness, there's a great social good that's done by publicly funded research and development, not just in medicine, but in information technologies as well. There's a great piece in what is it, Foreign Affairs or Current Events, or I don't remember. Some one of those like socialist magazines that they have a very bland and throwaway name for because they want to sound like The Economist.
and not like socialist.
Yeah, exactly. Not like Jacobin, where it's like they kind of wear it on their sleeve. But no, they did a really good piece on the history of the internet and how like the internet was developed mostly through taxpayer funding through a combination of the military and the university system. Um, and the MRI development was largely done as a product of the space race, which is like a combination of the military and university systems again. So like there's this long history in the United States of R&D being done. Nick pointed to HIV/AIDS and polio as examples of this process that are specific to medicine. That is just that has been completely gutted. Really, like after the Reagan Revolution, it's slowly been gutted away, and I miss that. I've never really, neither of us have really been alive when that process was as robust as it was in like
Like you
the
missed something that doesn't has never existed.
right, exactly. I'm what is it? The Mark Fisher thing. I forgot. I have to go back and reread
I don't
Mark
know. The
Fisher.
Eisenhower administration is already all of a sudden seeming decent. Um, like so. What the real question though is like these companies are going to profit hundreds of billions of dollars. We know that for sure. Both of these companies are likely to profit hundreds of billions of dollars off of their vaccines. It'll in it basically whichever one's better will go to the first world, and whichever one sucks will go to the second world. And that's how it basically always works. You're going to get a lot of doses that'll go to, for instance, if it's this refrigeration issue, you're going to get a lot of doses that are going to go to countries like Mexico and Ecuador and Brazil that are going to not actually work because they haven't been properly kept, right? And then you get that same kind of like, so there's some like, in America, there are vaccine denialists that don't have a leg to stand on. But in second world countries, they're vaccine denialists that do have legs to stand on because they've taken a lot of vaccines that just don't work because they weren't properly kept. They didn't follow the correct chains. They don't have things like flu vaccines that are given out every year, right? Like even though those would be very easy for their governments to create and maintain, they don't do these sorts of things. So the real question is like, does this basically just create a situation where everybody goes back to business and we just allow a mass culling of the second and third world because their vaccines don't work?
What's been going on with neocolonialism? I mean, like the Bolsonaro administration in Brazil
Yeah,
is goddamn horrific.
protests.
The Duterte administration in the Philippines is scary. Um, Africa has had like a spat of warlords and civil wars across there, and a lot of that is just the response of the European and American colonial adventures in those countries. So I think to pretend that it's a new problem is missing the mark a bit. I think it's more a question of like what new form is this like sort of just complete disregard for the well-being of people in the global south, like what form is that going to take?
Yeah, I just think that like there's going to be a real situation here where it's like, well, first off, we already know like all of the first vaccines are not going to the second and third world, right? Like they're all going to first world countries that can pay more for them, right? There are not going to be people in South Korea and Japan that are needing vaccines, but there definitely will be people in the Philippines and Indonesia that, right? Like there won't be people in the United States and Canada that need them, but there definitely will be people in Brazil and Argentina, Chile that need them, right? And we're going to see this globally, right? Europe and Africa, right? This is just the commons of the global north and global south and the way these economic systems work. But the trick is this, right? When the West goes back to work, say it's spring, say it's early summer, where we have sufficient numbers of vaccines, where the vast majority of our youthful populations can have the vaccine and are able to go back to work. Because that's the real, I hate to say it to the boomers in the crowd, but those are the real people who make the economy work, right? They're the operators at plants. They're the truck drivers. They're the steel workers and automobile manufacturers, right? And they're the people who are driving cars to work every day and using gas and using all these economic things. And they're the people who are buying and selling goods. Typically, those individuals do not typically aren't, it's not as important that the CEO of a company is physically in the building as it is that the truck drivers are physically in the building moving things, right? So what I think we're going to see with this in this sort of vaccine war is going to be that there'll probably be a third and a fourth company that'll pop on later, right? That will have found basically the same vaccines, right? Because there's clearly a sequencing that works, right? We have two different companies that have found it. It's a matter of time till other companies find it. And then once the product gets onto the market, those companies are going to do corporate espionage to figure out what the hell the vaccine is, right? So the second that like Moderna and Pfizer actually start selling their vaccines, right? They have a very short window because all the other pharmaceutical companies that don't have a vaccine are then going to find theirs, look at it, and then recreate their own process to create something similar to it that's different enough that they can't claim that it's trademarked or patented, right? Like, so what we're going to end up with is a whole host of later developers of this vaccine, right? But when the West goes back to work, right? When the East goes back to work, when the global North starts to interchange again, there still will be demands for products that come from the global South, right? We're still going to want our coffee and chocolate, right? We're still going to want our diamonds and plutonium, right? And so that is going to put pressure on these global South countries that don't have vaccines and aren't able to access these things to start pushing their workforces aggressively out into the communities to do these sorts of things. So I think that I wasn't contending that was a new thing. I'm just saying this is going to be a new set of harms that are going to be repulsed, right? Like a brand new set.
My objection was less for correcting you and more for the benefit of any audience members that.
Yeah, so I think that there's a real issue with the way that this vaccine. I mean, like it's the same otherization and globalization process that we go through every time there's a new invention, every time there's something that saves people's lives, right? Countries in the global South always get left out. Those countries are never actually taken care of. And a lot of that is because we don't actually work with organizations that are global, that could actually produce beneficial outcomes for everyone. And instead, we work within our own private entities so that we can control through money where that purchases go to. Because there was a global advantage if the entire world had came together and had started funding a mass vaccine campaign, like through the WHO or through the UN or through somebody that's a global organization. I can guarantee you we would have had this vaccine 2 or 3 months ago. Because if you put the right minds in the right rooms and you tell them to solve the right problems, and they have unlimited funding to do that, they will figure it out, right?
But instead, we've got to pit all those people against each other in these different firms where they're keeping quiet, they're not sharing innovation. And when they're not doing that, that stifles innovation. So very contrary to the sort of libertarian notion that like markets solve every problem. This is like the if anyone is still persuaded by like the basic claim that like markets are always good, like that markets are net better than government in almost all situations, that's just a like this pandemic should have disabused you of that notion.
Yeah, and so like I think that like the kind of conceptualization that we didn't have a global response, right? And I'll be completely honest with you, the two biggest reasons we didn't are named Trump and what's his name from the UK, Boris Johnson, right? Like these two guys are the reason we didn't have a global response.
Yeah,
Because
I
if
mean,
Boris Johnson and Trump had said, let's have a global response, let's work with China and Japan and Korea and the EU and Russia and try to come up with a
it
global
would
response to this, it would have happened because those power brokers
because
can make it happen.
the post-war global order moves at the pace that America and the UK set it at, because we were responsible for a lot of the post-war reinvestment in Europe and Japan. We have been the global hegemon for the past 70 some odd years now, and in that capacity, we have all of these, we basically have leverage over organizations like the UN, like the IMF, like the World Bank. We can make these things, we could have made these things work. I'm not going to engage in apologia for any of those organizations because I think that they all do
Oh, they do
terrible.
shitty stuff, but they also do some good
Yeah,
stuff, right?
they have the potential to
Yeah.
do good things.
Yeah.
And like that's the real horror story of World War II, not to get too far off on a tangent, but the horror story is that like there is this beautiful moment of international cooperation where there is this like possibility of like a new mode of interconnectedness where like, borders stop mattering so much. Look at the Schengen Agreement, the EU, and where like maybe we could have like a real philosophical discussion about how like cooperation, what role does cooperation versus competition play in society, and instead it gets squandered into this sort of like, let's create a capitalist, like neoliberal capitalist order that spans the world in order to fight off the evils of the godless communists. And
Yeah, I mean like the Marshall Plan in action, right?
yeah,
So
makes me
the
sad.
the thing is that like had we done these things, right, like we probably could have come up with the vaccine quicker. The reason we didn't, though, and there's a very clear reason why we didn't do this, is because we didn't want a vaccine that was globally accessible. We just don't want that, because if we do that, then that means less vaccines for our people in a shorter period of time, right?
America first, baby.
America first, right? America first doesn't just mean put Americans before
America
other
first
countries.
all the time.
Yeah.
And this is like there's no thought put towards how interdependent we are with other societies. Most of the goods in your house were not produced in this country. Most of the food you consumed is not produced in this country. So to pretend like we can just be this isolationist, that's fantasy.
Yeah, I mean, so we don't do that. We don't create a global order. So then we have, people like Dolly Parton are the reasons why we have a vaccine right now. Because
Lots for Dolly.
because
In
Saint
addition to
Dolly,
in addition to delivering fantastic like literary programs for children in impoverished communities and stuff like that, she donated how much money to the
I don't know, it was something like 40 or 50% of the research funding, though. It was some
amazing.
aggressive amount of money, and that is the backing that led to the Moderna vaccine, right? So it is largely, the question then becomes, though, if Dolly Parton can do that at Moderna, what did all of this money that supposedly Bill Gates was giving to organizations actually do? Or did he never actually give that money? Right? Like, do we really know if he did
He gave it. I
invest?
think a lot of it has to do with buying stuff. Like for example, this is kind of unrelated to the vaccine, but like in New York when Cuomo was redoing all of the COVID regulations for schools and stuff like that, a lot of the deals for distance learning were struck with Microsoft. And a lot of that is really just like, hey, we'll give you all this money and support for stuff like that. But there's conditions on it that, ultimately end up benefiting the interests of the companies that he owns.
Okay. Well, I mean, I think that like there's a question though, like in a world in which you have ultra billionaires, right? Um, do they have a fiduciary responsibility to the society's economy overall? Right? Like, does if we realize that Dolly Parton herself, right, and her organizations and the money that she's able to fundraise, not a tech giant, not a someone who's owned hundreds of amazingly fantastic business, but really a music brand that was very successful and then built out from there, right? Smart businesswoman with smart people around her, right, that built her brand, right? If she can have this kind of effect on Moderna, what is the fiduciary responsibility of the other billionaires in the United States, and why aren't they held accountable if they hold such a disproportionate amount of our wealth?
Well, because they get to decide how they spend their money. It's private for a reason, and they like this is the system working as designed. Dolly Parton gets to decide that she wants to give to Moderna, but Elon Musk is under no obligation to do so.
Yeah,
Um,
he's too
Now, I
busy
think that they
trying
are
to build
under.
a base on the moon.
I don't think that they should have that much money in the first place. I don't think there's a world where it is ethical for one individual to hoard that much wealth. Um,
Especially
but
like the Bezoses, right? Like
yeah,
the like there's a difference between like somebody who's super successful and ran a great business and makes millions of dollars and someone who makes billions of dollars based on the fact that they could lose hundreds of millions of dollars for 10 years,
for sure. I mean, like
right?
like my mom, my mom is like fairly well off, and when we get into debates about politics, she's like, "Your candidates want to take all my take all my money away," and I'm like, "Mom, when we talk about taxing the rich, we're talking about taxing Jeff Bezos. We're not. No one is thinking about you."
Yeah, I mean, so even the Biden plan, right, that everybody was like screaming and hollering about, right, was creating a what was it? It was a new tax on people over $400,000. It wasn't actually a percentile tax, right? Like it wasn't even a. It was like technically millionaires would have paid like 1.3% more than they did under Obama,
Hmm.
right? It wasn't a, I mean, like it was only based on the money over the amounts that of $400,000, right? Obama famously created that amount at $250,000, right? Was the number that they had used during the Obama administration as what is the highest tax bracket, right?
Everything
And
he's doing is Obama plus. Like
yeah,
it's
yeah,
literally Obama policies plus. It's the refugee cap from Obama plus like what was it? What did we say last time? Like
25%.
25,000 extra
Yeah,
people.
like 25%, I think.
Okay.
And but like the thing with it is like either A or B has to be true, right? Either A, these millionaires and billionaires do have a fiduciary responsibility to their societies, or B, they should be forced to have a fiduciary responsibility towards their societies, right? Like it's downright criminal what's going on at Amazon right now, right? With the whole like they're firing people for getting corona but not being able to afford the testing that they won't buy for them, right? You're making $15 an hour, you get coronavirus because you're working in a Amazon warehouse,
Hmm.
and then there's no testing from Amazon they'll give you. They won't like you don't have health insurance unless you've been in the company for more than a year, right? And on top of that, you're told go get a test. You can't find free testing, or there isn't free testing, or isn't the right free testing, then they dock your pay as if you're just not showing up to work, right? While Bezos is making hundreds of billions of dollars during the this whole thing, right? So it's like when you don't have, and like he gets pressured. Bezos is the most visible figure when it comes to this sort of stuff. But the idea that this isn't happening at every level of every one of these billionaires' organizations is a simple lie.
Well, I mean, we talked about our good friend Betsy DeVos and her brother Eric Prince, who runs one of the most successful uh, uh, military contracting companies in the country. Like they're all rich billionaires.
Yep. and all they want to do is defund public education.
Yeah, I want
So
to on this topic. I'm trying to look up some books that I want to recommend to any audience members that are interested. Do you know what there's a book about, like, I can never remember this author's name, but it's about like charity and sort of like these win-win relationships and how like that ends up reshaping the world in a way that is like beneficial to businesses.
I do not.
Okay, I'm gonna have.
But we talked about Dolly, and one of the things I want to say though is like this isn't shitting on Dolly Parton, right?
No, we love Dolly.
Dolly did what every millionaire and billionaire should have been doing during this vaccine. Every single one of them should have been like, you know what's good for my business? Ending this shit. Right? There should have been massive investment in these sorts of projects. But there wasn't. And the
Because
reason
it's
there
about the
wasn't.
quarterly report. It's not about long term.
Yeah.
It's about it's a short term thinking, not this long term slow growth planning that like a lot of people want to ascribe to these people. These are, monkeys with typewriters.
That are super reactionary to the numbers that come out.
Hmm.
The reaction of the oil industry should not recognize that prices are inevitably going to rise, and the choice to not hold on to huge numbers of their employees and instead furlough them, right? The only major oil companies that weren't able to do that were ones that have unions, right? Like ExxonMobil has a very powerful union as a part of it, and that's the only reason why that company chose not to completely screw its employees, right? It wasn't out of the goodness of their heart, right?
Hmm.
It was that if they did that, they then would have to renegotiate their entire union contract, which could cost them hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of billions of dollars. Even though that union is very, very friendly to the company. That sounds odd because you think of unions as very hostile entities towards companies, right? But that union and company work hand in hand together very, very, very well, right? Another example of that is the Kroger's union. Kroger's Incorporated. They have a very powerful union as part of their organization as well, and they also work hand in hand together very, very well, right? So these larger organizations like this provided protection for their workers that we don't see in other businesses. In fact, in Kroger's, they were getting paid hazard pay um, at, during in places that had coronavirus spikes. If you
Hmm.
were in a location that had coronavirus spikes in your zip code, then they were getting like I think it was $3.50 more an hour. Every employee, no matter what their salary was. So I mean that's not terrible. I mean if it's a hell of a lot better than other organizations like Walmart did, right? Like
I know HEB got a lot here in Texas. HEB got a lot of praise for the way they handled things, but I think a lot of that might have been more theater, not necessarily like labor for the theater of it. Making people wait in line to go into the store and stuff like that, rather than worker
well,
protections. I could be wrong. I haven't looked into like
I,
HEB's practices too
I do
much,
know
but
that most of the grocers, not all of them, but most of them were providing testing for their employees free of charge,
that's
and
good.
were accessing testing for their charge. They weren't sitting in like the line. I live next to Energy Park, and that is where one of the major testing facilities in the city of Houston is. And every single day, there were hundreds of cars lined up to go through the testing facility. Every single day. So, if that's happening every day, if you don't have the economic ability to sit in a line for 2.5 hours, right, you're not going to
Hmm.
be able to access that sort of money, right? That sort of testing, right? Even though it's free, like it was free testing. I'm not pretending, right? Like it was free testing, publicly funded by Harris County, right? But it was not accessible to people who can't sit in the line for 2.5 hours. You have a kid, you have a job that you go from job to pick up your kid to having to feed your kid, having to put your kid to sleep so that you can wake your kid up at 6 o'clock in the morning so that you can bring them to school. Because let's not pretend like the grocery workers aren't having to bring their kids to school. It's not like their kids are getting to do online learning, right? And so you have those sorts of situations occurring, right? Like, and while it's great that they did that, right? Like it also does. Without that, it would have been impossible, right? Like those grocery workers had an impossible.
I think it's a little. Uh, optimistic to assume that most of those people are having one job. It's often like shuffling from job to job, and like having to fight managers for schedules and stuff like that, and not having basic protections provided for you at work and stuff like that. It's just an awful situation. Okay, so I finally got it. The three books that like this conversation has made me think of that I want to recommend to people to read. First of all is Disaster Capitalism by Naomi Klein. She's a Canadian author who writes quite expansively about the environmental crisis that we are in, and about how companies have positioned themselves by to profiteer off of the suffering of people who are, you know, being displaced by climate change and whatnot. I think that a lot of the thesis of the book overlaps with the current moment that we're facing with the coronavirus, and how people like Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos and others have cynically exploited the needs for new communication technologies and institutions like schools to further privatize them, or to just expand their business operations without providing basic care for their
By
basic
Naomi who?
workers. Naomi Klein. It's
ALIN?
Naomiklein. The next one is Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins. And this is specifically about the ways in which the IMF and the World Bank have been used to basically keep the global South under the thumb of the global North via exploitative loans. It's basically makes the case that the World Bank and IMF are basically a Quicken Loans, but for, you know, for
For countries.
for countries. Yeah. The third book is Winners Take All by, and I'm going to butcher this guy's last name, Anand Girihardis. Anand is Anand. The last name is Giridharadas.
Yeah.
And he has a wonderful talk at Google if reading isn't your thing.
Good luck with that one. All right.
Yeah. He has a wonderful talk at Google where he talks about the book. The general thesis of the book is that corporations use charitable giving in order to seem like they're doing good, while you know, to varying degrees of cynicism, restructuring the economy and so the economic and social spheres of our lives in order to benefit themselves. At some point when we get to talking about the CIA and stuff like that, I can recommend some about like the American Foreign Policy Project and how that is like worked to screw over the global South, but that's for another time.
All right. Since we're talking about ultra corrupt politicians and corrupt systems of government, let's talk about Lindsey Graham. It has come out that Lindsey Graham was attempting to pressure the Secretary of State of Georgia, conservative GOP member, a very well-respected man within the House, within the Georgia political machine, to cast aside legally cast votes in the major metropolitan cities of Georgia. And he not only said no, he then went in front of the media and outed Lindsey Graham as trying to do this, and then said, quote, "It's Trump's fault he lost this election. Had he not scared people into not voting by mail, he would have won." And his proof of this was that the previous election they had over 26,000 Republican mail-in ballots that had come in during the previous election, and they had almost none in the presidential election. So because he railed so hard against mail-in balloting, it was that Secretary of State's belief the reason why Trump ended up losing Georgia was because he told people that he was going to go after mail-in ballots.
I legitimately think that that's why that and like his overall mishandling of the coronavirus, those two things combined are the reason he lost. I think that in a world where the coronavirus wasn't as expansive as it was, or it never happened, and in a world where mail-in ballots just weren't really that big of a deal, Trump wins every time. I don't think Biden.
Maybe.
I don't think
I
Biden.
don't
That's
know.
a big,
Pennsylvania is still a hard win for Trump, even with some mail-in ballots, right? That's 62,000 or
but
something.
I don't think in that world Michigan goes for Trump.
Maybe. Um, but you also just have to also add into that, even when it is allowable, right? Conservative people tend to be more conservative about their ballots, right? So you're still going to get a lot of people. The question is how much of it would have been a trade-off versus how much would have been additive, right? Um, would ballots have been, we know from the history of the United States government that ballots tend to get lost because they benefit Democrats. And so would enough of the Republican ballots have gotten lost in that same process, right? Of ballots magically getting lost by the USPS right after you defunded and put a political hitman at the charge of it. Would that have also affected Republican ballots? That's the real question, right? We don't know. But you know what? I am perfectly content with Trump shooting himself in his own foot. He seems to have been doing that for 4 years. So
He's been doing that for longer than 4 years, but we can cap it at force because we don't need to go into all his business dealings.
Yeah. So Lindsey Graham is under FBI investigation right now
We
for
love to see it.
Attempting to persuade a member of the Republican Party in Georgia to dump ballots. And so we have that going on. And I'm actually going to skip order here because Harris is going to move further down.
Okay. I don't have a take on the Lindsey Graham thing. I'm unsurprised.
Then at the same time, in the great state of Texas, we have possibly the most corrupt attorney general in the history of the state. And that's saying something, given the number of corrupt attorney generals in the state of Texas that have existed. But this dude is straight taking bribes. And his entire organization is like, he's straight taking bribes, y'all. And then he fires all of them, which looks even worse, right?
Like, are they taking him to court now?
And now the Federal Bureau of Investigation has announced that it has been and is currently in the process of looking through all the various statements that have been made against Ken Paxton over the last 5 years. By the way, I've included 3 or 4 different court cases that should have removed him as the AG of the state of Texas, and were all magically moved to super conservative districts.
Shocker.
With super conservative judges. No, and I don't mean like Dallas, okay? I mean like far West Texas. There are only 585 people in this county who are deciding whether the AG of the state of Texas was guilty or innocent of a. These were like, yeah, let's not have it in a place where there are like lawyers and judges that aren't elected. Let's have it in a place where there's a political appointee that requires funding from the state GOP to run his campaign. And if he doesn't do this the way that we want him to, we'll just primary him and get rid of him. Right? Like, very blatant, not an attempt to hide it. And then the most recent thing, and the thing that hasn't been adjudicated in courts at all, is that basically his entire staff came out and said that he's taking breath. No ways around it. They're like, he is taking pay to not take cases. He's taking pay to get the Attorney General of Texas to defend corporations instead of prosecute them by Texas state law, which is the job of the Attorney General of the state of Texas.
Right, but like the whole of the Texas government is horrendously corrupt. And I feel like if you live in this state and you don't know that,
Dan Patrick.
You are living under the biggest of rocks.
Or David Patrick. David Patrick?
Dan Patrick. Dan Patrick is lieutenant governor.
I had it right. He's also Like, he's next.
Well, he's the guy. He was the first Republican to give out the talking point of like old people should throw themselves on the sword of on like should sacrifice themselves so we can make the squiggly line go good. We must appease the line.
Makes the economy look pretty.
Yeah,
But so what's interesting about this is that most of the tactics the AG of the state of Texas has used previously has been because he's the AG of the state of Texas, he can do certain things. The issue with that now is the FBI is not going to try him in a state court. The FBI is going to try him in a federal court.
Mm-hmm.
And depending on his task, it may not even be a state of Texas federal court. Because if you are found in connection with an attempt to affect international corporations, you then are under the Interstate Commerce Clause. If you're under the Interstate Commerce Clause, then it then becomes a political question, which means that it goes to the Fifth Circuit Court, which, if you don't know, is located in Washington.
And is historically like pretty
liberal.
Yeah.
Like, it's a real bad place. You don't want to go there if you're anybody charged with any kind of conspiracy claims, because they have a very high conviction rate in that court. And the FBI is using some of his shenanigans previously as the justification for why it shouldn't be held in a federal court in Texas.
Well, I said it before. I love to see it. What makes me sad about this is that it makes it very hard for me to maintain my anti-FBI stance because they're doing good things right now.
Your FBI stance is having problems right now?
My FBI stance is having very big problems because I also have a very big anti-Ken Paxton stance.
Well, so I think the trick here is that...
Can we say they're both bad?
We can definitely say that, but I think the greatest gift that President Trump gave us was pissing off the intelligence community. Because the intelligence community is now willing to dismantle the Republican Party. Something they were never willing to do before.
Because the Republicans kept him in good grace.
Oh, dude, the Republicans were the best for him, right? Like, what
the problem is that now centrist Democrats have that luxury of, and they will wield it ruthlessly against anybody who is remotely on the left.
Or right, it doesn't matter. They're just going to use it against everyone who's their political opponent, right? Like,
yeah, who's not a centrist Democrat.
Yeah, I mean, that's the definition of Biden and Harris.
Yeah,
I mean,
yeah.
But what you're going to see is you're going to see a lot of corrupt politicians in the next 4 years get outed on both sides of the parties. You're going to see very liberal mayors in major metropolitan cities, Atlanta, get outed by the FBI. You're going to see very conservative governors and people who have ran states, and also lieutenant governors, AGs of various states, secretaries of states that had problems with their elections. These people are going to get run over by a train that is the intelligence community. Because the FBI, let's just put it this way.
They liked being nonpartisan. They liked being the little G-men in the dark who could like kind of do whatever they wanted with like free government money and never really had to answer for anything. And then the Trump administration comes along and drags them kicking and screaming into the sunlight, where like all of a sudden now they're being paid attention to, basically screwed over the FISA collection, like the collection of FISA warrants. And now that's a big political hot button that like nobody knew about until like even after the Snowden revelations. Like everybody thought that Snowden gave away, troop movement stuff. Nobody was really thinking that it was like, because nobody bothered to look into it because this country's so fucking anti-intellectual that they didn't bother to do 2 minutes of research on it. But the point that I'm making is that like they had a security blanket of being able to operate in darkness because nobody really knew what the FBI did. And insofar as they did, it was like through shows like Criminal Minds, where they
glorified the shit out of them.
They glorified the shit out of them, and also like profiling is goddamn pseudoscience. If it was affectatious, they would release efficacy data on it, but the FBI doesn't release data on it. You can see police officers' reports on profiling and whether or not they think it's helpful. So unsurprisingly, they do, but like I don't really trust on the ground cops to make accurate assessments of whether or not a like method of like psychological profiling as employed by the FBI is affectatious.
I'm far more seedy and evil than you. I think that it probably is, and I think that they're using science that they're not releasing to the public on purpose. I feel like they've probably done science experiments that we don't know about that are probably very, very, very amoral. And I'm pretty certain that they do have good data that proves these sorts of things because I think that's their business. I think their
That's
business is corruptibility. Their business is control, right? So if you absolutely can corrupt and control people, then, or you always know how to make it seem like someone is corrupted and controlled, then you have the ability to control people.
I
And
don't disagree with any of this. I'm gonna put a pin in it by saying that like I'm speaking strictly about the version of profiling that has been made public via different books that have been written, documentaries that have been made. What is publicly available and known about the history of profiling and the sort of processes that are alleged to be used, those I think are pseudoscience.
well, and then the two grandfathers of the entire process, right? Like mysteriously don't talk anymore. Seriously, like don't give interviews anymore, and or died, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a process of it where it's like these are two people that were not in the good graces of the FBI that all of a sudden became in the good graces of the FBI. And I don't think they become in the good graces of the FBI unless they actually find something, right? Like not just a PR stunt, right? Because they're still like hot at Quantico. You know what I mean? Like, so
Yeah,
I
I
think
don't know, man. I go back and forth on this.
there's something there. There's something there.
Okay.
I'll say.
All right, I think so. What do we want to talk about next? Do we want to talk about Harris's seat, or do we want to talk about these
Let's
memos?
talk about Harris real quick. I think that's a simple one.
Yeah, yeah.
So the big thing this week was shocker, Trump's an asshole, and the Senate are assholes, and so instead of letting Harris, like, become the vice president of the United States and go through transition processes, which they've been actively preventing, they instead start trying to force through votes for confirmation of the Fed of a member to the Fed. And so the interesting, I can't remember what this lady's name is. Do you remember, Eric?
I can look it up real quick. Hold
Yeah,
on.
but regardless, basically what she is a complete political tool. And I don't say that in a mean way. I say that in the nicest way possible. This is a woman who's wrote extensively about how the Fed should not exist, about how the gold standard is a good idea, about how pre 20th century economic policy is good. And then the second she became a Trump appointee possibility, she has flipped the script 180 because Trump likes low interest rates and Trump doesn't like things like gold standard. And she has completely changed her tune on what she believes in a matter of 2 months.
So, what is she in favor of? Like monopoly money?
She's in favor of whatever Trump wants her to be in favor of.
So, monopoly money.
Monopoly
Okay,
money.
her name is Judy Shelton, and I had just read a bunch of articles that said like she widely disagrees with like acting people who are in the Fed as an institution, as well as like most mainstream economists. I hadn't really looked into it much.
Correct, but her entire confirmation hearing has been how she agrees with mainstream economics. Right? Like, she is a political operative, period. She is known within her own circles as believing whatever it takes to get the job.
Well, I'm glad they shut that down.
So, this is literally what's going on within these kind of conceptualizations, right? Oh, okay. I'm getting the girlfriend is sending me text in the middle. I was worried it would be something like, "We can't hear you." It wasn't that. So, what we have is like we have these sorts of discussions that are occurring. So what happens is Harris has to run back to Senate, literally gets on a private plane and flies across the country in the matter of a couple hours, runs off the plane tarmac. Like, if you've not seen a woman run in heels before, one, it's a power move.
Is there video of this? Hold on, I want to see.
One, it's a power move, and two, Kamala Harris, it's a double power move. Because she's just like, she looks pissed. Like, you fuckers made me come back, didn't you? And that's basically the entire conceptualization. But she gets back. There were, I think, 3 Republican senators that were out, 2 because of coronavirus, 1 because of a family emergency. All the Democrats showed up, and 3 Republicans voted against it. All the Democrats voted against it. The 3rd Republican to vote against it, very importantly, was Mitch McConnell. And the reason he voted against it was because if he votes against it, then he has the ability to redo the vote at another time.
Okay, I'm seeing the pictures of her actually like running now. You're not kidding.
Dude, she's running in hills, dude. Like, it's a power move, okay? That's a scary woman to make angry. Like, I don't want to be in the Senate. If the Senate is 50-50, she will be the most powerful woman in the United States.
Yeah.
It won't be close. She will make the votes go the way she wants them to.
I don't know that that's entirely true. I think that like that rules out like people like Joe Manchin and what's her name from Maine who like fashion themselves as kingmakers.
Well, Joe Manchin so far hasn't done anything.
Yeah, but he's basically said that on anything that he doesn't like from the Biden administration that they're going to have to like court him.
He just wants people in his office saying, "Please, Mister."
Yeah, that's what he and God, what's the lady's name from Maine?
Oh,
the insufferable one.
She just got reelected too.
Yeah, she was projected to lose, but she didn't. I don't care.
The other one lost. The problem is the 2 women that had like, actively not, done what they said they were going to do and allow, like, they were the 2 that also voted against the Affordable Care Act being removed without a new plan. That eventually was the final vote was McCain.
Right.
They were. But basically, what happened is she was forced back to the Senate. So basically, your vice president-elect of the United States is having to play with children in the Senate because they can't behave themselves until January 20th. So instead of being able to do proper transition work, which they were doing actively, right? Like, granted that Henry Kissinger is a war criminal, he was preparing them for the transition, right? Like, and I think that's probably someone you would want to prepare you for a transition to the presidency, because once you become president, you also become a war criminal. So
I 100% agree with that take. I've said that that leaves my mouth at least once a year with
Henry Kissinger is a war criminal.
No, that once you become president, you become a war criminal.
I mean, you largely do, unless you were to make a complete 180 of U.S. foreign policy, right? Like, the only way you don't is like you withdraw everything from Iraq and Afghanistan, and no one's willing to do that because that would be basically leaving Iraq and Afghanistan to the whims of countries like Israel, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, right?
It would be a huge ceding of geopolitical control. There are people there who would like most certainly be killed as a collaborationist, which like those interests are loud. I don't think that like people in those powers really care about like people in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think
Iran does.
Iran does. I'm talking about U.S. politicians. We care about what Iran thinks because we view them as like a geopolitical enemy because of their relationship with OPEC. But I think it has a lot more to do with domestic production than we give it credit for, because like, these people with, tank factories in their districts keep on pumping out tanks despite the army telling them, no, we don't want any more.
Yeah. So that's sort of going on. So let's do this. You want to do revolving door or new consensus first?
Well, we had mentioned that we were going to talk about Harris's seat. I am very excited to see that Ro Khanna is in the mix for that nomination.
So I have a question though. It's a state nomination, right?
Yeah, it's Newsom gets to make the nomination.
Yeah, okay. And Newsom is going to make one that the Democrats will definitely like.
Yes. So Ro Khanna seems to be in the good graces of the centrists, but he's being supported by his nomination has been supported by Bernie Sanders. So I am tentatively hopeful he will get it, but I would not be surprised if he got snubbed.
Okay.
That's really all.
It's really just up to Newsom, whatever Newsom wants, right?
Yeah, he gets to make the decision.
Yeah. All right, cool. So new consensus or revolving door? Which one are we doing first?
Which one's more interesting to you?
Which one was the shorter one?
Revolving door.
Let's
I
do
can do that.
revolving door first because we can knock it out, and then we can spend as much time as we want on new consent.
All right. I want to pick that one apart. So I found a couple of memos this week I found one last week, and then I found this one this week, and I find them both fascinating, and they're full of interesting ideas. Mainly because I've been saying for quite a while since before 2020 that Democrats don't play hardball with Republicans, that they need to learn how to do that, and that should a Democrat ever take the office of the presidency, and as Joe Biden has done, they will need to do that in the future. This is more imperative now than ever, given that the Senate is going to be in Republican hands. So, what does playing hardball actually look like? A think tank called the Revolving, I don't think it's a think tank, it's an organization within another think tank, but the Revolving Door Project has an answer for us. And if you don't mind, I'd like to read a little bit aloud from this because the memo is beautifully written. A false narrative undergirded by self-interests and misguided assumptions is dominating early transition coverage. Key voices are already insisting that Joe Biden's presidency will fail to deliver on any of its promises. According to this view, with Mitch McConnell in the Senate, Biden will not only be impelled to abandon his legislative vision, but also any hope of delivering for the American people via his power over the executive branch. They say that to wrest confirmation from McConnell's hands, Biden will have no choice but to appoint moderates who will not rock the boat. I want to be clear that this is flattering of Biden, assuming that he will ever keep an electoral promise as made on the campaign trail. But it kind of has to be because they want to appeal to him. The idea that they're going to go for here is that it is incorrect to make that assumption, and you do actually, as the executive, have quite a bit of power to do what you want. And so it's a way to get ahead messaging wise of the centrist excuse that is inevitably going to come when Democrats probably lose the Senate. That, or even if they don't lose the Senate and they maintain it, that like they can't rein in Joe Manchin, which will be the same excuse they gave for Obamacare, which is that we can't control conservatives and we can't control the conservative members of our caucus. And this is kind of a pushback, an early pushback against that narrative that was literally sent out on the 6th of November. So literally 3 days after the election. I don't even think we had definite vote counts in Georgia by this time. Continues, this is wrong. Over 80 million voters will have cast their ballots for change. A reversion to a business as usual centrism that enjoys no such mandate at the behest of a Senate majority representing a minority of the country's citizens would be a betrayal. President Biden will be under no obligation to hand Mitch McConnell the keys to the cabinet. In the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, McConnell defiantly and proudly asserted that he would make Obama a one-term president by blocking a meaningful federal response. The insufficiency of the federal response led to a midterm bloodbath for Democrats. Biden must not allow McConnell veto power over how he constructs his administration. If McConnell refuses to confirm a cabinet that reflects the country's desire for an aggressive response to the pandemic and economic crisis, Joe Biden has tools to ensure that he fulfills his presidential mandate. They outline two. The first is the use of the Vacancies Act, which provides an indisputable, a legal channel to fill Senate confirmations on a temporary basis. If this sounds very familiar, this is the mechanism that the Trump administration has been using. However, Trump only really expanded upon something that other presidents have used before too. This is already existing law. This is something that they can do and they can make a legal case for it. And in a court of law where like Mitch McConnell has gone on record saying that he plans to be as obstructionist as humanly possible, I think that the Biden administration has a good case to make in the court that the Vacancies Act was appropriately used and wasn't being abused as it was under the Trump administration. So from this memo, I give that recommendation a 10 out of 10. I think it's 100% correct. I think that Biden should leverage that as much as possible. I doubt that he will. But again, this is more of a progressive counter messaging against centrists. I don't think that this is actually anything that they expect to be taken seriously on.
And to be fair to this, this is from the Center of Economic and Policy Research, which is not a particularly liberal think tank. I mean, the economists behind this are people like Richard Freeman, Janet Gornick, Robert Solow, and Joseph Stiglitz. Right? These are the intellectual minds behind the economic assumptions of these papers, right? So these are economists, right? These are like pro-capitalist economists that are pushing these sorts of narratives, right? So it's not about, like their board of directors has all
I
sorts of
think that
people on it.
the people that are heading this particular project, I think are a bit more progressive. Like they might be within a more like, moderately liberal organization, but the people that are heading this
It's a
project.
it's a largely globalist organization is the real thing with it, right? So I don't think like by our traditional understandings of liberal conservative it makes any sense because the difference between liberals and conservatives in the United States versus in Europe is
That's
mind-blowingly different.
That's fair. I watched an interview with the guy that's the head of this, but that was like 2 weeks ago, and I've largely forgotten it now. So my brain doesn't work so good these days. All right. So the next recommendation that they make is that Biden can adjourn Congress and make recess appointments, according to Section 3, Article 2 of the U.S. Constitution. So basically, if Biden wanted to tell Mitch McConnell, if you want to be a part of the conversation for any of this, like you can come to the table and deal, or you can play games and, fuck around and find out. And I think that this is 100% the appropriate response. I think that Democrats for too long in this country have not played, have not treated politics as the tribal blood sport that it is. And they have ceded that ground entirely to the Republicans. And that was the reason for Trump's sweeping victory. That is the reason that Republicans have had so much electoral success over the last, 20 years. 20, 30, 40 years. Since the Reagan Revolution, Democrats have been scared to be Democrats. They've been scared to champion left-wing policies or anything that would remotely help working people. We need to get away from that. And I think that these are great recommendations.
So I think I have, I think that the recommendations that don't go far enough. I think that what liberals really need is they need someone who's willing to put Republicans in such a demeaning and derogatory situation that they can't possibly get out of it. What I mean by this is I would usurp the power of Mitch McConnell entirely. And the way that I would do this is that I would say, we're going to do these appointments unless a group of conservatives wants to have a say in this. That group of conservatives cannot include Mitch McConnell. In the process, completely screw the Republican Party, because you can find enough centrist Republicans in the Senate that would want to say on these appointments, because they're being funded by big businesses and by these companies, these large corporations that probably exist in their districts, that want a foot in the door. And what you do is you do so by removing Mitch McConnell from the conversation altogether. You don't let him in the room.
I think that's a great idea.
I think that the way that you do this is you say, Mitch McConnell is an obstructionist. You follow him, we're going to appoint whoever the heck we want. And if we can find a situation where we're equally liking two different people and one of them hurts your district, we're going to hurt your district. And not say that publicly, but say that very directly and very privately to people who have constituencies that matter.
That's how LBJ got the Voting Rights Act through, is he basically went and threatened all these Southern Democrats and told them, look, like I will go and I will primary you.
And, he doesn't have the authority or ability to do that because he's not the leader of the Republican Party. But what he can do to these Republican senators is say, hey, you know how you have that Foxconn thing going on and it needs CFIUS review?
We'll make sure it won't happen.
We'll make sure that review comes back real negative for you.
Yeah, I mean, they can, and they have the power to do that. The problem is that they don't want to do that because they're buddy-buddy with these people.
Right. I think it's time that we break out the political guillotines and we start chopping off heads that don't do what we want. And that's the real world that we need to be living in right now, because right now, the idea of allowing government to be held hostage by a group of 65-year-old plus white men who don't actually have any political or ideological base whatsoever, besides getting rich off of their foundations and getting rich off of their running for campaigns, because each and every campaign that they do, they magically make hundreds of thousands of dollars off of, millions of dollars off of sometimes, and all of a sudden everything's reimbursable in their entire existence as being, right? So the conceptualization.
And meanwhile, the American worker, is struggling, that having to work 3 different jobs just to meet the basic necessities of life in the richest country in the world.
You know what? We figured out that the Republican Party is full of shit when they had complete control of the U.S. economy, complete control of the House, and control of the Senate. Didn't do a goddamn thing.
They didn't repeal Obamacare.
They didn't repeal Obamacare. They couldn't even get that done because they couldn't get their own caucus in control, right? So the idea that like this is somehow the party that creates good positive change for the economy is absurd. They don't actually do that. All they do is invest more money into their friends' pockets at the highest ends of the economy, and then they access those pockets indirectly through forms of legal bribes that are allowed by federal systems, right? And so,
to be clear, you're saying Democrats do this as well.
oh yeah, absolutely,
worse and more public about it.
But my point is that like if you don't have the power and you need to get policy change done, right, then fucking do it, right? I don't want to hear your excuses about why you don't do it.
I don't disagree with any of this, by the way. My point of saying like I 100% approve of these policies is I think that this gives the Biden administration a sort of like, it gives them a very like milquetoast presentation of like, hey, here are some tools you have if you need to do this. Like I think this is much more within the realm of like what we can reasonably expect from a Biden presidency. I don't think that he's gonna like play hardball and say like, oh, your Foxconn thing needs approval. Like, well, if you want to come back, he's not going to do that. He's not. You know
what though? I disagree with you entirely. I completely disagree with you because he has had a significant history of playing hardball with people throughout the entirety of his time within the White House. He was the attack dog for the Obama administration. And if that attack dog mentality wasn't just Obama needing an attack dog and Joe Biden filling a role, and was instead that is the nature of Joe Biden, that's the nature of a Joe Biden presidency, I can see him having someone, a political operative, very clearly, within the White House, maybe his chief of staff, that is literally threatening people. And I don't know if that's not the correct move to have in this hyper-partisan world, right? Like,
I think it's great, and if he does it, I'll eat my hat.
Right? I think I said on the last episode, right? Like the reason why, what's his name? The guy that's in Russia right now.
Snowden.
Snowden is in Russia right now is because of Joe Biden.
Yeah, 100%. I read him as more of having more of a cooperative streak. Like I think that he'll go out on the attack, but I think that a lot of that energy is going to be directed not at Republicans who he wants to see as potential allies, and much more so at the left. So at the Bernie Sanders.
I think that if he does that, then he's going to make everything that people have been predicting about his presidency true.
I agree.
Which is that he is going to doom his own presidency.
And
he will be a worm-term president. He's very old, so if he survives this, I mean that in a like health sense,
like
right?
If some Trump lunatic doesn't assassinate him.
No, I actually mean it in a health sense. I think he's very, very old.
Obviously,
right?
He can barely put sentences together most of the time.
Yeah, I mean it's the saddest thing about this election is that Trump lost to a corpse. And that's really sad. Like
that's honestly like the most embarrassing thing. Like if he had lost to like, I don't know, like losing to Hillary Clinton would have been.
Yeah, but I mean, like losing to like, let's use one of the ones that actually is running, like not Bernie and not Biden.
Bernie's old as dirt.
But like if he had lost to like a new wave movement of the Buttigieg moderates, right? Like, or if he had lost to Kamala Harris directly, right? Or if he had lost to any of the other like major Democratic running,
a lot less embarrassing.
Huh?
A lot less embarrassing.
It's way less embarrassing because you at least have the claim, well, people were voting for historic, right? Like it's not my fault, right?
Right.
But like it's like, no, they chose the other old white guy that looks older and whiter than you. And he was like, his whole plan was to not campaign so that you would say stupid shit so that he would win. Like the Biden campaign was to not campaign. I mean, that was the strategy. Let Trump bury himself. That's exactly what Trump did.
So I 100% agree. I want to finish with this though, because the memo's conclusion is a great threat to the Biden administration. And it basically predicts the point that you finished on, which is failure to use these powers, however, will spell political doom. In a new poll, 67% of respondents and 75% of Democratic respondents agreed that Biden should build his administration without relying on executives and lobbyists from big business. A McConnell-approved cabinet will bring nothing but a continuation of the government by and for corporate America that American voters have just rejected. If Biden fails to use these powers available to him, Democrats up and down the ballot will suffer for it in 2022 and
They
beyond.
already did in 2020.
I agree. No,
like-
I 100% agree. I think Joe Biden, like, the reason he won was because he flipped those moderate Republicans that he wanted to flip, and not because of any, like, a special left
Not what
turnout.
the data says.
Really?
The data of the election says the reason why Joe Biden won is because there were a massive number of new voters that had never voted before.
Do you think that that's more of just a unique response to Trump, though, rather than like being
Yes.
particularly
I think
ideological?
that's an entirely unique response to Trump. I think that Janet, who's 35, 38 years old, had never voted before in her entire life, and her grandma dies from COVID.
Mhm.
Right? Or, John loses his job because of COVID. Or Marilyn has a niece that got really sick and almost died. Right? And I think a lot of those new voters were pushed out by COVID response. Right?
I was speaking particularly about like the.
I don't know. The data says he did worse with Republicans than Hillary Clinton did.
Really, I haven't looked that hard index.
Yeah,
I haven't
like the Lincoln Project was a complete flub.
Oh yeah, well they
every aspect of, 96% of registered Republicans voted for Trump. With Hillary Clinton, it was 94%. So I mean,
how many of those people? I guess how many of the people that they were actually targeting though are like registered as independents or stuff like that?
There's very few people in the United States registered. Independent registry is very, very small.
I agree, but that's kind of like the mythical beast. That's the unicorn that we're always chasing.
I don't think it exists.
I don't think so either, but I'm saying because
I think the real failure of the Democratic Party is that it doesn't actually radicalize its base. Right?
I 100% agree.
Because if it were to actually get the reason why is because students had their there was a record number of 18 and 19-year-olds voting. You know why they voted against Trump? Trump screwed up their freaking graduation last year.
Mm-hmm.
All of them were seniors last year and didn't have a graduation, didn't have a real end to a senior year. They were pissed. They also are bored right now because they're probably on a computer in their mom's house instead of at UCLA or at UT Austin in a dorm room hanging out with friends, right? So these people were just pissed. And there was a huge, we've never, ever seen a turnout like that from that particular demographic, the 18 to 19 demographic. I want to point that out. Not 18 to 25, because 18 to 25 looks kind of okay-ish, but the smaller demographics, the 18 to 19 and the 21-year-old demographic, were aggressive, right? And they're 20 to 21. Sorry, not 20.
Well, while those kids are pissed off, if you're into organizing, this is the time to strike while the iron is hot. People tend to respond to politics when they're pissed off about things. So let's
if my Rockets trade James Harden, I am going to become a Dallas Mavericks fan. So
why would you not come over to the Spurs though?
There is Greg Popovich.
Greg Popovich is the only reason I follow the Spurs personally.
But Dallas has Luka.
All right, we're not a sports podcast, so we can't stay on this for too long. Do you have any closing thoughts on the revolving door stuff, or how are we feeling?
I think my only response to the revolving door stuff is yes, thank you for explaining the exact legal mechanisms that this can be done, but I also think that it also misconstrues the power of the president. The president has way more power than they're even describing. The power of the executive order is even more powerful than what they're talking about. Mm-hmm. And also,
to be fair, they don't mention executive orders at all.
Correct. But it's way more powerful than the sorts of compromises they're attempting to create. But also, more importantly, right,
the president has extra legal means.
Absolutely.
Their ends. But these are recommendations that they're making to a campaign that they know are going to be public. They can't necessarily come out and say that. And I don't think that the people that are writing this necessarily have that inclination.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I think that this is too measured, right? It is a very measured, very, very tactical response. And I recommend that it is both of those things, measured and tactical. right? But it does not do the things that would actually push the American populace in a direction that would lead to us actually having economic interdependence, lack of economic interdependence on major other foreign powers, things like the development of our entire energy grid into a way that we can completely sustain that energy grid without access to other sources of fuel, right? It doesn't actually create a paradigm shift that allows for workers in industries that are going to die in the next 50 years to have access to new economic opportunities that are in similar fields, right? Like the number one example of this is the coal worker, right? Needs a transitional strategy because that job will not exist in 50 years, right? The amount
Well,
of coal that will be mined in the United States will not exist in 50 years.
I agree that it does not address any of those things. But again, that recommendation was specific to cabinet appointments. This next memo that I have for you is specifically about how to recover the economy and make it to where we are less interdependent
All
on
right,
other
well, we got
countries.
to
And
do this one in stages because I'll be honest
it's
with you.
long.
I'll be honest with you.
What?
My eyes like over of one of your readings.
Okay, I'm sorry.
So
I
let's
apologize.
break it down smaller, right? Like let's do like a paragraph and then we can respond to it and then we can move on. You know what I mean? But pick your paragraph.
All right. First paragraph is just congratulatory nonsense, so we're not going to waste time on that.
Woo!
Urgent task, coordinated response, yada yada yada. Arresting ongoing pandemic is big achievement. We're going to rebuilding, renewing, deindustrialization, industrial. Okay, there's all these like hyperlinks, and I'm just looking at those. They recommend a three-legged stool plan as a response
Are they
or as a
former
method.
policy debaters?
Do what? They're like extempers, I think, because extempers talk like
A
three.
three still plan. All right, let's
Yeah,
go. Let's hear
three
what the
legs
first.
to a plan.
Let's hear
So
what the first leg is.
the first is the task. This is definitely the extempers that wrote this because they named all the
Might have
points.
been a national championship extemper. I wouldn't laugh too much. They probably speak way better than we.
Oh, probably. I don't pretend to be nearly as competent as the kids I coach. So basically, there are the ambition that they need to outline has three distinguishable but mutually complementary objectives, what they call the three I's. They need to foster, nurture, and scale up self-sufficiency in the industries of tomorrow. That includes solar, wind turbines, generators, 6G networks, life extension, space exploration, things like that. Basically what we did in the 1930s to the 1940s, but doing it again. So we're talking New Deal. Then there's, if you are a student of history and you've paid attention to the New Deal, predictably, they're going to recommend infrastructure development. As Bernie Sanders was fond of saying, we get a D something from the Army Corps of Engineers in the way that they rate our infrastructure, which is very bad. We would like an A, but we're not getting that right now. We're getting very bad infrastructure ratings. So they want to basically scale up all of the infrastructure that everyone relies upon. The power grid. They point out that businesses, industries, and citizens all rely on this. Then they speak on investments and how we are going to maintain these strong investment strategies across the country. And that I think is the more interesting part. So part two is the instrumentalities, the way that they're going to do this. And
So give me your one sentence explanation, Rick,
my one sentence explanation
of the first plank.
So basically, we need to invest in industries of the future away from coal into solar and other technologies as well. We need to develop infrastructure and we need to develop investment.
Yes, we do need to do all of this.
So it's New Deal 2.0 is what this paper is
So it's
suggesting.
like somewhere in between the New Deal and the Green New Deal.
Basically, yes.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
I think they're basically just recommending the Green New Deal without that political labeling on it. That's what I think this really is.
Okay.
But a lot of the later recommendations are more specific to finance, though, which the Green New Deal doesn't talk about. It just kind of says oh, we can tax it and get away with it.
Oh, so they're
Yeah, these are that's what the next section is it's all the specific ways they're going to get at. And that's way more interesting than these sorts of, no-duh problems that you and I both are yeah, we should do that. That sounds great. Let's do it. What's interesting about this memo is that it tells us how we should do it.
I feel like the first What's the first how we should?
The development of a national development council.
That do.
They should form a national development council charged with two tasks: formulating and regulating and updating a coordinated national development strategy, highlighting industries and infrastructures of national global significance that the U.S. can and should foster, grow, and globally depend on. That's one. Number two, developing specific projects or project portfolios in pursuit of the NDS. This is what our national defense agencies do, and it is high time our infrastructural and industrial agencies did likewise. Think and plan systematically and strategically ahead. The council should meet at least monthly, should include an ex officio capacities, the Speaker of the House, House Majority Leader, Senate Majority Leader, and Minority Leaders, and both state and city officials, as well as private sector business leaders, in order to maximize input.
Sorry, I'm currently being hounded by a director of forensics of a certain Cypress school about a judge not starting their ballot yet.
Oh my. I'm glad we don't have anybody but debaters, because tomorrow we will have to deal with that.
You're going to
we're going
same
to
one we are, right?
Yeah, swing.
Yeah. That doesn't start till Friday, buddy.
Oh, holy shit, I thought it was
Today's Wednesday, bud. All right.
Time doesn't exist anymore in the pandemic. Do you have any takes on the National Development Council?
I don't know enough about what that would actually look like. Does that make sense? Like it feels like yes, of course, you should probably use as much leverage as you possibly can, expertise as you possibly can to rebuild infrastructure. That seems like a very smart idea.
So the big takeaway from like the modeling thing that I get from this, I haven't followed any of the hyperlinks that are in this memo yet, but there's like quite a few of them. It sounds to me like they're specifically recommending that they follow the formula used by the Department of Defense and like the other.
Yeah, but doesn't the Department of Defense have a large history of like losing tens of trillions of dollars magically?
I mean, yeah, but I think that's any large institution you have.
Tens of trillions? Weird.
To be fair, I think a lot of that goes to like destabilizing countries and stuff like that.
Probably.
I think a lot of it has more to do with like closeted interests rather than like, naked corruption altogether.
All right, so I'm playing the general public with you right now, Eric. I'm not interested. Continue.
Okay.
That doesn't set me on fire and go, yeah, that's a good idea. Maybe it's a good idea. Who's in charge of it probably matters more than that sounds like a terrible idea if we have Republicans in office.
Well, the whole point is that it includes like a lot of different people. So they mentioned like having the Speaker of the House and the House Minority Leader. They mentioned having the Senate Majority Leader and the Senate Minority Leader. So like it would.
I don't know. I'm against anything that includes Mitch McConnell.
I agree, but hopefully we can get rid of him or he croaks in the next couple of years.
I mean, he looks like he croaks often.
I think he's more of a. I always think of him as more of a turtle.
Turtle. I mean, he does look like looks like the turtle from that one show. What is it, Franklin?
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the next one, this is where we get more into finance world. Develop a national development bank that would be formed within the Treasury and function as a coordinating financing arm of the National Development Committee. They already have a federal financing bank that could be used for the purpose that they want. And their task would be to develop specific financial planning for these infrastructure projects that would be developed by the National Development Council. So you basically have the planning side and then you have the financing side. And that's what these first 2 points are setting up.
Yeah, that one totally makes sense because it's like you have to have a way of financing and describing the financing and make sure that the investments are actually worthwhile, right? Mm-hmm. Like we don't need a bridge to nowhere, right? We need bridges.
And it talks about
across the Ponson train, right? Like,
yeah, this paragraph also talks about different modalities that they could use for investment. So they could use direct grants, loans, forgivable loans, equity investments, combinations. They could also permit private investments along with public investment to absorb some of the investment capital that might otherwise inflate bubbles. Like there's a lot of cool stuff in here. I'm probably going to follow all of the links in this at some point and like read all the connected documents. I just found this morning and didn't have time to.
Fair enough. All right, so what else we got? What's
Uh,
next?
point
I
two.
mean, that part sounds smart, right? Like it just sounds
Yeah,
like the
yeah, yeah.
correct way to go about it.
Yeah, I think we could probably debate the merits of having, Mitch McConnell on a council for infrastructure projects, especially
I
given
would
that
just like to publicly state I'm against Mitch McConnell being on any council ever.
Mitch McConnell should probably be in jail.
I mean, yes, but so should Nancy Pelosi and a number of other prominent conservatives.
100%.
And
Speaking of, she just won her reelection to be speaker. Can you believe that?
I do, because Democrats don't have backbones.
No.
Which, by the way, I want to point out, Mr. Biden, you could be the backbone of the Democratic Party right now. The way you do it, by telling Mitch McConnell to go eat a bag of shit. And just usurp his power. There are two people that I would like to see their faces when someone just completely undermines their power. Their names are Nancy Pelosi and Mitch McConnell. I want to see both their faces when they don't want something to happen and it still happens.
Well, Nancy will just performatively clap and kneel in a kente cloth or tear up a speech. Like that's her reaction. We've seen that for the past 4 years or 2 years, however long she's been speaker. It's 2.
She is the performative white liberal woman, right? Like she's the same version of women who bought like these books about critical race theory and were trying to become, more woke and then still voted for Trump.
I don't know that many of those books qualify as critical race theory. Like
they're far more digestible, right?
I'm reticent to call Robin DiAngelo a critical race theorist. Because that's the one that everybody read. Let's be real.
But they're like if if I was trying to get a kid into Nietzsche, right? I'm not gonna make him read Nietzsche. Like I'm gonna get him to read somebody like Whitman, right?
That's fair.
And Whitman's definitely not Nietzsche, but he's also like getting them in the right direction.
Right.
To me, that's kind of Angela, right? Like getting them in the right direction, right? But having said that, right, like all these, white women go out buy these books. It's on the New York bestsellers list for months and months and months and months and months and months. And then we see they're more likely to vote for Trump than they were in 2016. So apparently the lessons were about.
Do you think he saw any of that data about like those books being sold and like that had a part to play in his like critical race theory is evil anti-American propaganda?
Oh, I can guarantee it does.
Okay, we can go on that thread another time because I feel like we could have some interesting conversations with that.
So what's the next thread of this MO?
Okay, this is my favorite one because I think that this is just like a good idea. And a good idea in a way that like having a financing arm for some sort of like national development project that you set up is like an obvious idea. This is something that like I haven't heard anybody talk about since like 2008. And it is called Spread the Fed. And the argument that is made here is to instead of have all of the Federal Reserve's loans being dictated by banks in DC and New York, instead to allow local Fed institutions to sort of administer projects that are in their backyards and that would help the communities on the ground that are near them to decentralize the central bank a little bit, like to have them focus more on a local level. That way, and this was something that got pitched as a way to solve the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009, because instead of having these like big stimuluses to like these large companies and then you don't keep track of it, and it's just a bunch of CEOs giving themselves, massive bonus.
Buybacks.
Yeah, buybacks and stuff like that. Instead, like these institutions can make sure that like can on paper at least make sure that they're going to projects that would help improve life for people in a single state or in a municipality, and to like raise the quality of life overall for people with like these larger infrastructure projects.
So my larger question is like, what I don't understand about it is, does it actually do that, or does it just solidify power into fewer hands?
So I can pull a direct quote
You know what I mean? Because like it feels like you just create regional czars.
So they already have this. That's the thing.
Okay,
It's
you're
already
just empowering those regional
right.
czars.
The problem
So it's
is
economic warlordism.
The problem is that these are administered entirely by shoestring staffs at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston and Federal Reserve Bank of New York, respectively, which makes no sense administratively and is unfair to the FRB staffs. We must accordingly spread the Fed by distributing administration of its locally oriented programs across all of the regional FRBs. The Fed board will afford guidance to the regional FRBs as to what counts as productive by reference to the NDS formulated by the NDC, on which the Fed chair sits. This will help integrate Fed action with both democratically determined NDC decisions and with NDB operations. Financing could be coordinated with regional FRBs, aforementioned MBD, blah, 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 more finance language.
Okay, so it's just taking what already exists and that's centralized in Boston and New York and spreading through all of the efforts.
Right.
Okay.
And
So there'd be one in
to your
Dallas.
point about oversight, the Fed chair would be on the NDC, the National Development Council.
Okay. So what would end up happening is Dallas would make decisions for the greater Southwest region. That's where our Federal Reserve is. And California would have one that would probably make most of the decisions for the western regions of the United States. And then there's one, I believe, in Kansas City as well. Or is it St. Louis? It's one of those two.
Right. And even if that's not perfect and not as, as distributed as one would like, realize that is still more distributed than it currently is.
Yeah. But is it as distributive as my webcam is pixelated?
You keep on zooming in and out.
Like no, it's doing it on its own. I'm not touching it.
Yeah, no, I know. It's
obnoxious. The focus mechanism does not work apparently. Okay. But so like you decentralize some of the authority of the Federal Reserve Bank into individual autonomous regions. I'm going to refer to this forever as economic warlordism, but sure, let's have economic warlordism. I'm all about that life.
I like it. We can make the bankers wear all the crazy Mad Max clothes too.
No, I think they have to choose, but they get to choose between like Into the Badlands styles, Mad Max styles, or Waterworld styles.
Oh God!
They get to choose one though, and each one gets to it's in order. It's going to be a draft for their costuming. And you know what? I'm even willing to say that the federal government should fund their costumes so that they're really good.
I mean, we fund the costumes for the army guys. We can fund costumes for the bankers too.
Oh, let's not call army fatigues costume down there. Or anti-fascism.
Okay. Everyone, there's a forget who it is, but there's a song from the 70s called Uniforms, and it's like it basically makes the point that everybody's wearing a costume all the time, but it calls them uniforms. And all right, the last point that
dress fatigues are definitely uniform, or definitely costume. They don't serve any purpose.
Fair. Okay. So the digital taxpayer wallets that it recommends are very interesting.
This is weird.
This is weird. This is the part where I got like, ooh, that might not be good. I don't know how I feel about this. It made me feel some kind of way, and I'm not really sure why. So, obviously, all of that stuff that they've laid out so far adds some sort of power, like local empowerment to people and expands economic productivity in regional areas. The concern is how they take advantage of that and how the government can sort of transact vertically, both with public entities and horizontally with each other. And the solution that they posit is to use a system called Treasury Direct, which it's a bunch of electronic accounts that allow people to buy or sell Treasury securities and convert it into basically a digital wallet that is given to them by the government. And apparently the digital service, sorry, I'm skipping that. This system can be migrated over to the Fed enabling our central bank to conduct leak-proof monetary policy by offering interest on people's wallets to slow down spending in periods of overheating growth and lowering rates, or
Repeat
even
that.
making direct.
There's no way I have any clue what that means.
Okay, so you know how the Fed controls interest rates
Yes.
on for business loans and stuff like that.
Sure.
For individual people's wallets, they can do that same sort of thing.
So how does this work? I put money into this wallet to pay my taxes?
To pay taxes, to buy bonds, to invest. I could like Cash App. That's how I read it, because they say that they can transact with public entities and horizontally with each other. So I assume that to mean like if I wanted to, buy that chair in the back of your room, like I could just like use
You
my.
can have it.
Oh, okay. Well, if I wanted to buy it, I could use my taxpayer wallet to send you money. I assume that's what it means. I'm not an economics expert. I kind of want to read more on this and revisit this. If
So like my other thought about it was like, how we have all these pre-tax abilities,
Mhm.
right? There's a bunch of money that's pre-tax. You can use pre-tax, right? Would this screw with that system?
Potentially.
Right? Would it
Uh,
mean that we have to put money into this wallet to fulfill our tax obligations?
I
And
mean, also
then
like let's think about it like this too. Like if these taxpayer wallets are something where they can control the interest rates, that makes me think that it's kind of like a savings account where like it has a natural interest rate on it already, and then they can adjust and slow that so that way like they can.
so what is it though? Is it like a high
I
yield
think to me
savings
it
account?
reads. That's what it sounds like. It sounds like it's like a bunch of things all at once.
But how do they fund it? Are they requiring optional placements
Man, I
into
don't
it?
I don't know. So that's what I want to read more
Because
about.
like so the first thought I had was, well, maybe what it is that they'll take your like federal income tax, place it into there so that you have a pool, and then they'll recommend that you'll understand what your taxing rate is. So you know how like most of us pay way too much in taxes to the government and then we get a check at the end of the year, right? There's obviously the option to not do that. Nobody knows this, just for the record. You can actually go look at your taxes beforehand and know exactly how much you're going to pay in them. You can do some very rudimentary work, and then you can create percentage point deductions on your taxes. So, like the tax form where it says check the number of boxes you want 1 through 9, it's actually not whole numbers. You can use partial numbers in there as well, right? You can say I'm 1.4. And if you're 1.4, the formula still makes sense. So they just use the formula at 1.4. And that's a way
Okay.
that you can save your money and get more money each paycheck. But
So I reread the bottom half of the paragraph, and you are correct that it will function like a bank for people, basically. The idea is that the digital wallet is like your bank account.
so
Um,
basically it's really a national bank.
yes. And the benefits of the system, quote from the article, will be A, commercial inclusion and free retail banking to all citizens, businesses, and approved residents. B, faster transaction speeds and hence higher money velocity and associated growth. C, secure payments and banking privacy. D, keeping ahead of global competitors like China and other countries now developing fast fiat currencies. And finally, E, an easy means of making fast small business loans in keeping with 2.2 and 2.3 just above. If you worry about too much competition with private sector banks, you can always cap wallet amounts at, say, $3,000. In the long run, banking more of the 25% of Americans who are now or underbanked will bring more Americans even into private sector banking as they grow
Okay,
used to the benefits
I'm
of
going to
using a cash.
say it. Alexander Hamilton was right.
So, so the part of me that likes this, that thinks that this is a good idea, is the part where they're talking about making it fast and secure and giving access to people who are or underbanked.
No,
I think
I think you're missing it entirely. It's a
well that's
national bank and it's absolutely good because it screws over banking institutions in a way that means that we never have to bail them out ever again
I agree.
because there's an option instead of them, right? So the idea would be that if we're like their money is already federally insured through the Federal Reserve. So if you let Wells Fargo tank, right?
I'm in the process of leaving Wells Fargo right now for a credit union because I can't.
So, but if you let Wells Fargo or Bank of America tank, then what the Federal Reserve does is it would just take those accounts that are federally insured and get reported as federally insured. And instead of fiating currency, they would just create a bank account at the federal bank level that has all of that money in it. And that's how they would federally insure it, which means that they wouldn't have to go through lengthy processes of remediation that are necessary for an actual bank foreclosure now, and instead would be able to fiat that currency into people's accounts without screwing them over for months and months and months. Right? Because one of the lies of the Federal Reserve is that it protects your money, because it doesn't actually. What it does is it protects your money after it's been audited.
Right.
So if you're at Wells Fargo, let's say, and it goes under, and we don't bail it out, right? And we don't bail it out. We don't give it any money. We let it die, right? Your money, the money you have in your accounts, will be stuck in those accounts for 5 to 6 months before you will ever be able to access it again. If you don't have livable income, right, or if you don't have some kind of way of accessing money outside of that singular account, right, then you're screwed. And you hopefully paid your mortgage this month, because if you didn't, you're going to be a month behind on your mortgage for the rest of your life. And
Okay.
so what this would allow is the removal of that entire process.
I think that's awesome.
I want to kill banks.
But I was focused more on a micro level. Like my analysis of this was focused much more on like the micro level, the way it impacts like, everyday people, not like the big macro political strategy of getting rid of banks, which I'm all for.
No, I think though that it creates a different strategy, right? Like, so the only portion of that entire thing that I didn't like was the idea of capping accounts at $3,000.
I think that's a sell to the number one, a pragmatic sell on the conservatism. I also think that it's an initial foot in the door thing of like, you cap
Here's
it.
the reason why I don't like it. Very simple. For the average everyday American, this account would be amazing. Okay? The reason why it would be amazing is because the interest rate would be directly derived from the Fed.
But
right?
for the people who keep these financial institutions afloat, by keeping all their money in them,
They would still, so
they'd still be in the Wells Fargos
they'd
and stuff
still
like
be in the
that.
Wells Fargos. And the reason they would still be in the Wells Fargos is
They
for
couldn't keep all
two
their money in there.
reasons. There's two reasons why they would do that. One is because Wells Fargo transactional histories can be protected. I can transfer money in and out of Wells Fargo from Switzerland, right? There's no issues with doing that, right? Which means I can hide money. The federal bank, you would not be able to do that because that transaction history would be obviously taggable, right? It would be like trying to launder money through the through your taxes somehow, right? Like, it would be a really dumb strategy because there would never be more scrutiny than in that exact moment, right? So for everyday Americans that aren't, regularly transferring hundreds of thousands of dollars, the system would work perfectly, right? It would be, ideally it would be a system without fees, right? It would also be a system without the egregious fees that are forced upon us by banks, right? It would also probably be, and the reason why it would benefit the country as a whole because of that is that it would make sure, well, first off, it would end the need for frivolous auditing. I don't need to know if Eric made that amount of money. We're the federal government, and he's part of the federal bank. Do his bank accounts look like someone who did this correctly or not? And if
this kind of gets into my what I fear about this, and what made it perk up was not any of the initial stuff, because I didn't read that deeply into it when I read this morning, but it was when they made the comparison to China and keeping ahead of global competitors. Because in China, most stuff is phone swipes. It's all digital banking over there, and for me, I think about the way that China uses that system of like largely electronic state-run banking to surveil its citizens and the way that they are spending money and stuff like that. And I look at our government that has a tendency of doing the same thing, and I think I get a bad feeling in my tummy when China does it. I also have a bad feeling about our government having that level of surveilling power over us. I guess what I'm saying is I'm extremely skeptical of the claims about privacy and security that are being made on this system. I think that in the abstract, it's a good idea. I think in practice in this country, I start to worry a little bit.
I don't think we have any privacy or security, anyways. The question of who.
That's a totally fair response to that.
I think the question is who has that access.
Right now,
the organizations that
selling my data to
right now the people who have that access have no incentive to keep it secret.
Right.
At least governmental agencies have reason to keep that data secret.
It's an intelligence. Yeah,
it's an intelligence figure, right? Because
I could be somebody who could be compromised.
Correct, and they would want you to be compromised, and also banking.
No. I mean, like I could be compromised, like as an intelligence asset or something like
that.
Not
I
compromise me as an intelligence asset, but like
you find out that you're being surveilled, so you move your money out of the accounts that they're using to surveil you, right? And then they lose access to that data. They wouldn't want to lose access to that data, so they'd make sure that you never know that they're surveilling you. The thing about that, right? Like it's the Snowden angle, right? Like the NSA didn't want us to know that they were reading all of our emails and text messages, right? The reason they didn't want us to know that is because the second that we knew that, all the companies that they were doing that to had to ensure their customers, they were putting blocks in to prevent them from doing those things.
That's like the Apple backdoor that Trump tried to force a few years ago.
Right, and Apple's like, hell no, right? Yeah. Like, because if we do that, then we're going to be seen as capitulating to like NSA projects and things of that sort. You're going to lose huge customer base, right?
Also, I feel like Tor usership went up after that too.
For sure.
So I don't know. I feel like we're both like largely positive on this. I do think that there's a healthy skepticism of systems like this for how they're used to surveil systems. At the same time, I take your point that it's like largely a non-unique concern that like we're surveilled by private interests already and that data is sold off to.
I mean, the government's buying that data, right? Like, just take the middleman out of the process, right? And also make sure that the data is less accessible, right? I think that they're secure. Like, so the idea that our digital data wouldn't be tracked by someone, even using Tors, even using all these sorts of other mechanisms, fundamentally misunderstands computer science. Mm-hmm. Like, the NSA will always be able to surveil our communication. It's their job. Rats. What they're supposed to do.
So I can't order drugs off the dark web and have the NSA not know it.
No, and they probably will use the fact that you're doing that to try to change, since we have such a massive viewership on a podcast, right? They're going to use that to make you an agent to only process what they want you to tell people, right? Because of our massive viewership. But, like Joe Rogan, right?
Yeah, Joe Rogan levels. I mean, hey, Trump won. If Trump can delude himself into thinking that he won the election, we're allowed to delude ourselves into thinking we have a huge audience.
Listen, we are as likely to have 10 million viewers as Trump is to have won this election.
Okay,
equally diluted statements.
All right,
but here's my tidbit on this: is that like these agencies, they're designed to create these sorts of situations. And yes, would I prefer privacy? Absolutely. Do I think that I have it? I do not. And I joke about this. All the time. But it's true. I will have a phone conversation with someone on the phone, talking words on the phone, and then get a freaking Facebook ad about something we were talking about.
Yeah, no, that's creepy. That's right? Weird. Creepy.
We'll get one.
Privacy has been dead.
Privacy's gone, right? Like anybody who thinks there's privacy is wrong, right? Now the question is who should control that data? I think individuals should. I think Wang was completely right about this, right? That we should have control and financial control over our data. And if I choose to give it to Google, Google should pay me for it. Right? If I choose to give it to Facebook, Facebook should pay me for it, right? Simultaneously, I'm much like they're seething and evil and problematic. But there's one thing that I know about the intelligence community of the United States, which is that they truly believe they are protecting Americans. They truly believe that statement. They do all their seedy, underhanded, terrible things. They truly believe that's how you protect Americans.
Hmm.
Okay? And I have no doubt in my mind that's why they do the things they do. Right? Conversely, corporations only do things for one reason:
Profit.
profit. So whatever is profitable, whether ethical or not unethical, they will do. Just like whatever is perceived as protecting the American people, the intelligence agency will do. Right? Similar concepts. The difference is one of those group of people, in theory, is trying to protect me. And one of those group of people, in theory, doesn't give a shit what happens to me.
Well, one theory in theory and in praxis doesn't give a shit about
Sure.
you. So the last section of this is nothing that we want to spend a bunch of time talking about
Okay.
because it's just the outline benefits. They talk about growth and employment, innovation and small business ownership, green tech growth. So there's like a whole green new. It's a way of sliding the Green New Deal in.
Sure.
Export growth, debt and deficit reduction, which that would be one I might be interested in talking about a little bit. Financial stability, wealth and income inequality, and then there's like a conclusion paragraph that we don't really need to talk that much about. It's not worthwhile. But were
So,
any of those benefits particularly interesting to you?
so let's talk about how the debt doesn't matter.
I agree. No. It's not talking about federal debt. It's talking about individual debt.
Oh well, yeah, we need to draw down into much as
Yeah, I
we
agree.
can.
But I'm in favor of like debt amnesty for everyone. So like, let's have a big old jubilee about it. And
I mean, I'm sure Trump would be for that right now.
dude, I know we kind of put troop drawdowns on the schedule, but like if he actually ends up ending the imperial wars overseas as like a fuck you to Biden and the intelligence community, I'll.
Well, I mean, Andrew Jackson, did the Trail of Tears, but also then simultaneously like weeded out massive amounts of corruption out of Washington D.C. by creating his own forms of corruption.
Mhm.
But like for the
Speaking of,
Jackson,
you were talking about guillotining people earlier. There's
no, no,
a
no, no, economic guillotine.
no, I understand, but like you had mentioned guillotines earlier, and it made me think that there's a folk punk group called Andrew Jackson Jihad, and they have a song that came out prior to the election called Mega Guillotine, and the video is literally just like Mike Pence and Donald Trump's heads in guillotines. It's glorious and happy and upbeat, and it like you should watch it.
Glorious and happy and upbeat.
Yeah,
That's a far-reaching take on the French Revolution.
it's not about the French Revolution. It's about guillotining Mike Pence and Donald Trump.
Well, I generally am not for ritualistic violence.
I'm not either, but after the 4 years we've had, I feel like America needs some catharsis. We
No,
need
I
to.
don't. I don't. I think we need to get angrier until we actually change the damn system.
Okay, I
Um,
part of me agrees with you, but another part of me that's been reading a lot of Bataille lately says that we need to
some
expend energy.
catharsis. Yeah,
We
okay.
need to expend energy.
That's why you shouldn't read
um,
Bataille as much. Um,
oh, he's
but,
so wacky though.
huh?
He's so wacky
I mean,
though.
like at times he argues for like hyper accelerationism. So,
Um, what book does he do that in?
there's one that he's talking about the concept of like smog,
I
how
don't think that's
smog
Bataille.
creates.
I think that's like Negrestani or something like that.
Maybe. But talks about smog and the conceptualization of smog leading to environmental changes.
I'm pretty sure that that's either Land or Negrestani.
Might be Negrestani.
Negrestani's the one that talks about like the oil in the Middle East being alive.
Yes, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Seems very similar. But regardless, like, okay, what was the last bit? Oh,
That
so debt. Like, I mean, like, I think that if Biden's smart, he walks into the White House and what is it, inauguration date? 20th of January.
Yeah, January 20th. And I know he's floated like debt relief and stuff like that, but if you look at the fine print of it, it's already like going to be means tested to death and stuff like that. So it's not the sort of like broad scope debt relief that you and I are going to advocate for.
Well, so like, but I think he's talking about federal debt relief, right? Like in the sense of like federal student loans.
Yes, but it's going to be means tested is what I'm getting at.
Okay, explain that.
So if we look at, I've got my friend who's into organizing was sharing a bunch of stuff about this earlier. Hold on, we were messaging.
Yeah, I just don't know what you mean by it's means tested. That doesn't mean it.
Oh, like means testing, like the amnesty for debt. Like you have to meet certain conditions is what.
So if you're a doctor that makes $250,000 and a surgeon, you don't get your debt relieved.
Right, you could pay it back.
Okay. Or
Um,
if you're
okay,
an unemployed artist, your debt gets
exactly.
relieved. Okay.
So there have been the AFR tweets that over 235 organizations call on President-elect Joe Biden to cancel student debt on day one using executive action. And then another commentator, Brianna Joy Gray, posts, there's so many caveats in Biden's plan the media isn't reporting. They pretend that Warren's 50K plan and Bernie's total cancellation plans were the same. They pretend Kamala's Byzantine plan wasn't ridiculous, and they'll pretend that you're ungrateful when you get slop. If you don't demand that all student debt be canceled, that grad and debt and trade school debt and private, I'm not sure how much of this is a talking point that Brianna Joy Gray is putting out and how much of this is like accurate to like
I don't think any conceptualization of the removal of debt that doesn't include trade schools is legitimate. You know what I mean? Like, how are you going to yeah, no, I mean, like, if a dude goes to trade school, like, that's a debt. That's a higher education debt, in my opinion.
I agree. I
And
agree.
they
But
should be treated the same.
the point that she's making in the tweet is that like is that they're not telling you about all the means testing that's going to go into it. The headline is, Biden offers 50K of debt relief, yada yada. That sounds great on paper, but like I think that what's being pointed to here is you know, are they going to throw means test? Like, is it going to be means tested and stuff like that?
Well, it
Because like
also
that's
matters what the means testing is, right? Like, so,
well,
if the means testing is based on,
but that's how you build resentment, though.
I don't really care about people who are resentful. No,
But
like,
you
so
need to
there's
mobilize.
the
You need to reach
aspect
those
of it
people.
though. But Eric, there's the aspect of it where it's like, what is the purpose of the program, right? The purpose of the program is to create more economic possibilities for those who went through college and went through trade schools and went through these sorts of organizations, create a better life for themselves, but took on debt to do so,
Sure,
right? So
100%.
that those people can take that money that they're spending on those debts and apply them to the economy.
I think
En
the
masse.
objection I think the objection that I have is the objection I have to means testing programs more broadly, which is that like that is how you create this middle class resentment that then creates like that then like stops people from forming like a broader class consciousness where because they see it as like, well, these people down here uh got things that I didn't get. And like I think that like that might be shitty, that might be petty, that might not be something we want to foster, but like that's just a reality of how a lot of people think. And like as long as like we're talking about like political mobilizing and stuff like that, that has to be a factor that needs to be put together.
But that's
That's why
inevitable in a world in which like people have already paid off their debts, right? Like you're
right.
already going to have that group of people that are going to be pissed off about it because they're
Okay,
going to pay back their
and
debt.
that's a fair objection to my point. But I think a lot of my thinking on this comes from like the discussions around healthcare and how we should means test federal care that were happening during the Democratic primary. I think that a lot of the examples that were given about by the more Bernie wing of the party saying that like, look, if you means test this, like you will ultimately have people who are pissed off that like that poor people are getting health care and they're not, or and it's just like you want to have as many programs be, in my opinion, you want to have as many programs be universal as is humanly possible, because then you kind of create this like, well, it was needed at the time.
Well, it's just
And
a myth of equality is what you're providing.
right, but I think it's like when you start creating qualifications and stuff like that, I think that starts to get tricky.
You mean so when you start being equitable?
No, I don't think it's
I'm pushing you, Eric.
okay.
You're describing I prefer an equal system over an equitable one.
I think that there are instances where this is like where that is good, like in the healthcare debate. Okay,
That means
like
testing is good?
no, that means testing is bad.
Okay. We weren't
I think
talking
that
about
there
that. We
are.
were talking
I think
about
that there,
student loan forgiveness.
right. I think that my initial inclination is to say that, like, generally with federal programs, like, the idea is like you should want as many of them to apply to as many people as possible.
I agree
Uh,
with that statement, but that doesn't mean that you don't have means testing, right? Like, so for instance, right? Medical school, law school,
mhm.
that could be a means test. You could exclude medical and law school from it, right? Someone
Okay,
finishes medical school or finishes law school, they have the potential for substantially greater incomes than people who don't.
that's
Potential. Not necessarily they do that. But if you choose to go to medical school or you choose to go to law school, you're making a very conscious decision after you've already made several decisions. Once you're a grown adult, because you're like 21 by this point,
true. Mhm.
right? Of taking on an excess of debt. I can make an argument far better for the 18-year-old kid that thinks the only way that he can make his way in life is to go to college, taking on debt, not fully understanding the process that they're going through. Right? But if you're going to go to medical school, you're going to go to law school, right? Like, I don't know if those should be included. Now, does that mean that the debt you incurred in undergrad shouldn't be allowable? No, absolutely, it should be. Right? You should just not be able to apply it to the loans that are going to medical or law school.
Okay, that I think that that's fair. I like, again, this isn't something that I have like a hard and fast opinion on. I'm just saying, like, my initial inclination is to say, like, we want to avoid creating situations where half the population ends up feeling like a good, or at least like half the population ends up feeling resentful about it for whatever reason.
So then it's about like actual means testing. What does mean testing mean? And the
Right.
conceptualization of what Biden wants to produce. Like if means testing means we don't, like if you're maybe there's stipulations on income limits, right? That could be a possibility, right? If you make more than $400,000 a year, you can apply for this.
Mhm.
Or it could also be take the form of which types of education are allowable, right? Maybe trade school and undergrad are, maybe grad school's not. Who knows, right? Like, I don't know the answer to that question, right? Should grad school be included? Probably, maybe. I don't know, right? It is a decision that you're making at a later stage of your career. A lot of people go to grad school either A, on scholarships, or B, through work programs, right?
But I also think that now that, like, undergraduate degrees are becoming undervalued, you're seeing more people having to, like, go to grad school.
I'm not, but I think that like if we still pay up to the 50 on your undergrad, then your choice to go to grad school should be your own,
That's fair.
right? I don't I just mean which debts are targetable, right? So for instance, right, like I do not have $50,000 in debt, so I would not get the full amount, right? I do have a lot of debt towards school, but it's not 50,000, right?
Mhm.
So I don't get, the $14,000 extra or whatever, right, in my pocket, right? I only get what I can pay off of the loans that are federally insured loans, right? That are the federal loans, right? So if I have private loans, those aren't paid off either, right? So
Yeah. I I guess my broader pushback is, like, because I don't disagree with what you're saying, like, in the context of like a, like, ongoing program that would relieve debt. Um, I just am kind of more in favor of the one-time jubilee, like, wipe all the debt.
I prefer the conceptualization of the wipe the debt one time and then make college education, the undergraduate portion of college education, free. But or
Ideally,
also that includes,
we'd have free public college. That
and
would
to be fair, that includes trade schools. That includes like medical schools that teach you to be nurses and things of that sort as well, right? Like I'm not
right,
excluding any of those groups. I think they all should be free. I
right.
think you should go to the school that you are aptitude for, right? Based on what you would need to learn, not necessarily based on the cost, right? There are certain people that go to certain schools not based on what their actual degree want
But
is,
because of the social
but
capital.
because of the social capital that's associated with that school and or because of the cost of that school, right? Like how many people go would be much better if they had, you know, what, let's say you're a social worker, you want to be a social worker, right? There are some of the best social work colleges in the world in California, but nobody can afford to go to them, right? So would those people then be able to access those forms of education? Could you get better education in social work, right? Or conversely, there's all sorts of other jobs, right? Like I just use
Yeah,
social
I
work as
think
an
I
example,
to
right?
me it's just like it's like I don't know why we need to have this like continued ongoing program of like let's get like a whole debt relief program when we could really solve most of the debt problems that people are dealing with by like eliminating the institution of college loans, like of loans for higher education, and making public college free. And if you want to go to a private school, like do so on your own dime or take like a loan from a private bank or something like that, and then like just wipe the debt for everybody one time and be done. I
Okay,
think that
I have,
solves.
I have one more question for you though.
What's up?
They wipe the debt for everybody. You include parents that paid for their kids through loan mechanism.
I think that like there is sufficient historical basis for society-wide debt wipes. That like I'm talking all debt.
Okay, so you mean like, well, do you actually mean all debt? Because I don't think you mean houses and cars.
That does get tricky.
Because
Man,
you're just gonna sell people their houses for free.
it's so hard to like have like we debt is so into our system that it's really hard to deal with that.
So I think the better way to deal with it is to do it incrementally through different processes, right? Like, so I think that there's certain debt forms that are aggressive and bad, right? So former homeowner debt that was derived particularly from things like balloon payments and things of that sort. Yeah, I mean, like predatory practices should be wiped out by forgiveness, right? The
Mhm.
companies that did those predatory practices can suck it because they did predatory practices. And they should take the hit for doing those things, right? And if you
You know,
bought
you know
loans
what?
from predatory
I
practices,
was
it's your
gonna
own fault.
I was going to equivocate on the subject, but I'll lean into it. Yeah, I do think that like people should have their houses. I do think that like everybody who needs a place to live should have one. And I think in fact we should build more free houses for people who don't have free houses right now. I'll lean into that take. I'm not like
All right, so I'm not willing to lean into that take. I think that there are definitely predatory forms there are definitely predatory forms of debt and non-predatory forms of debt. Um, and I also think that some of those non-predatory forms of debt are wealth building, and thus that's good, right? Particularly homes, right? And land and property tend to be wealth building. They don't generally go down in value over scales of time, right? They
mhm.
generally go up in value, and everything you pay into them tends to accelerate their value, right? So the more I pay into my house, the more value, liquidity it gives to me, right?
Right.
And that
And like I think that that's probably like the least offensive to me. I think that the take I'm leaning into is that like you would ask, so you want to give everybody their house for free, and to me it's like yeah, everyone deserves a place to live.
sure,
That
like
overlaps with
I
that
don't,
overlaps with another issue that I'm overlapping it with another issue a little bit.
I don't disagree with that idea, but like you discussed not liking, like you would literally just create a middle upper class and screw the poor if you did that.
I think if you like, this is not mutually exclusive with other programs where you have
Sure,
like,
but that program alone would have the effect of creating a middle upper class and screwing everyone under it that doesn't own.
yeah, yeah, that's fair. That's a fair criticism. I don't know what the solution is. Part of me is like, let's just develop uniform, like really nice public housing, like luxury public condos in old police departments, and like, have you seen that speech where that lady is like, I think that this building would make lovely, lovely condos to the whole police department.
All right. So that was Eric for you.
I will fire
This
off at
is
least one
this
spicy
is
thing for
this
two
is
hours
the
straight.
this is the portion of the podcast where I just look at Eric and go, "What are you talking about?"
Here.
Um, but regardless, I don't think that. So in some ways, housing markets I think are good, and I think that it's not necessarily bad. I think that Americans in particularly are extraordinarily individualist, and we're not going to become collectivist. That's just not in the cards, right? It's a culture that's divine, that's whole purpose is this like Protestant ethic of individuality and hard work, and those are things that are so embedded in American culture
I
that
don't
you're
think
gonna have a very
culturally
hard time
I
getting
don't
rid
think
of them.
making us culturally collectivist is the solution. I think it is getting Americans to see the like to see how they individually benefit from more collective structures.
Sure, and I
Like,
think we've done that in the past. Like Social Security is extraordinarily popular, right? And that is a social system that is
Medicare.
collective and helps people. Medicare is very popular, right?
Hmm.
These sorts of systems are extraordinarily popular, not just with the elderly either, right? They're just very popular systems, and they have historically been very popular. However, I think the selling of those processes and procedures needs to be about ending predation in the market. I think that's the way you sell them. You sell the argument for a federal bank not on the basis of it'll be more secure, it'll be safer, but on the process of it won't be predatory. It doesn't have an incentive for profit. It only
Right.
has an incentive for for structural movement and for maintenance of taxes. And then you build into it all sorts of advantages that you wouldn't have in private banking systems, such as like for instance, they could totally do this and they would screw banks, but you know how like when you do your taxes and it takes like 2 weeks to get your money?
Now, no more of that.
None of that. Next
I
day.
but okay,
If
so
it gets approved, it gets allowed, next day, all of a sudden it's in your account. If you're in a private bank, 2, 3 weeks.
so I would just argue that I think you could make the same argument for like widespread public housing. That
I'm not
like,
against widespread public housing and this as an alternative to rent seeking. Does that make sense?
yeah,
I'm not against it in that conceptualization. I think that's probably good. I do know that you would screw a lot of markets, right, and a lot of wealth generation markets in the middle tiers, right, the middle upper class wealth markets.
right. But
Um,
like, think about it. If I could go like access, if I decided that I wanted to go live in, assuming we're not means testing it, right, which is kind of getting back to this broader thing on means testing that we're talking about as well. If we're not means testing it, and I'm able to just decide, what, I hate paying this mortgage payment to this like loan servicing company every month. It's way too expensive. I can't afford it. I would rather like, I don't know, save up to start a business or do something like that. If I had the option to do that, that kind of frees up and creates public competition with a market force. Because right now, public housing is seen as like undesirable.
because
But
of how aggressively means tested it.
yes, and I think that if we opened it up and made it to where people had that option, and you had like actual like infrastructure developed, like where it was a nice place to live. And some of it is like some housing now is like pretty nice, but like I think that like more could be more nice, and that like we expanded our imagination as like what public housing could be and what it
So
could
we
look like.
expand our imagination to as it as the stepping stone process before buying your own home, perhaps even could be a description, right? Like what do you do when you graduate college? Well, you go get public housing for about 5 or 6 years. You build up your income so that you can go buy your own home.
Right.
That
I think it's a wonderful
that
idea.
could be a process, right? The obviously the silly naysayers are going to be like, well, people could abuse it. It's like it's not abusable because it's accessible to everyone, right? So if you want,
Also,
if
like private systems get abused. So fucking what?
yeah, so I think that like I'm not for the idea of wiping all debt. I
Okay.
think that there are types of debt that we can get rid of. I think that they're particularly predatory debt, right? Or systems of debt that are created in a predatory manner, right? So balloon payments are the most obvious version, right? Like those should be. If you're under a balloon payment, I think that they should literally wipe your debt out, tell the bank to go f themselves.
Yeah.
Um,
Um,
but on the rest of it, right? Like I think that they're like you make choices and you should have to live with those choices, right? Like if I choose to buy, a junker to save money, right? That should be my choice, right? If I choose to buy a brand new car, that should also be my choice, and I should have the financial ramifications of doing so. But having said that, right, it's not that there isn't more oversight needed on those sorts of systems as well.
I'm putting some more books that I would recommend to the audience in chat. I will talk about them in a little bit.
We can talk about them now.
Well, hold on. I want to put the names in chat so you can type them.
Names in chat, so okay, we'll do that for you.
And what's the other one? Actually, I'm not going to put the other one in there because these two are good. It is one that cites it, though, and it gets read in debate a lot. So maybe you can guess.
This chat.
Maybe you can guess. So the first book that I'm going to recommend is Debt, the First 5,000 Years by the late David Graeber. He's an anthropologist and an anarchist who does a 5,000 years. David Graeber is a hero, like wonderful, wonderful person. He also wrote a really cool book called Utopia of Rules. That's really good, where he argues that like the capitalist form has basically produced as much, if not more, bureaucracy than the Soviet Union had. And that's kind of a spicy take that he has, but I find it agreeable. So Debt, the First 5,000 Years is basically a 5,000 history of the concept of debt. What differentiates this from other financial histories of the world is often they look at credit. He looks at what Fred Moten and Stefano Harney call the underside of normative systems. So he looks at the flip side and how like it is how extensions of credit are used as modes of control, and how a lot of the value judgments that are placed on things like debt play to like these very sort of rudimentary moral judgments that we seem to have across all cultures. He also gets into how not everything needs to function as a market. He gives lots of historical and like cross-cultural examples of how different tribes from different parts of the world have handled concepts of debt remediation and conflict avoidance and things like that. It's a long, interesting book. Was on like a lot of top 10 lists around the time of the 2008-2009 financial crisis. It's a very worthwhile read. Carceral Capitalism by Jackie Wang cites David Graeber at length and discusses the ways in which municipal finance and credit extensions are used to create extensions of the prison industrial complex and how they are used by the court system in order to basically entrap people in their homes. And it is a very sad book, but it's also like very accessible and easy to read. And it's a good introduction to a lot of post-structuralist theory as well, because there's a whole section in there on Foucault and Agamben and the other guy, David Esposito.
I just heard Despacito.
Esposito.
No, but
Despacito.
Very white.
I know.
Very white.
I know. I'm aware I'm melanin deficient.
So Eric is the leader of our podcast book club. If you didn't know, he is the official provider of podcast book club. And if you have any questions about books, he's your guy because I mainly read articles. But that's the different sides of our politics, though, and that's very important for people to understand, right? Like Eric is very much into these sorts of philosophical texts in particular that are talking about political philosophy and other sorts of things of that sort. And I like the nuts and bolts politics. I think he does too, but that's my thing. My thing is nuts and bolts, right?
Yeah, I would say that like it's a close two.
A close two.
Yeah, it's a close two.
Because if you learn anything from this podcast, it's that Biden needs to grow a spine and tell McConnell to sit in his chair. And if it does that, he will have a successful presidency.
Actually, I think if people learn anything from this podcast, I would hope that it was stuff about like mutual aid and organizing and things like that. But like,
I meant this one today. We haven't really talked about any. We haven't really talked about any mutual aid and organizing today.
I want to. I so want to though.
Yeah, we can. I want to produce an entire day of it.
Okay, wonderful. We can do that, and we should probably get a list of like organizations and like things that we want to talk about and like make recommendations to people. That would be cool.
Sure.
All right. I'm tuckered out.
Eric, any last words? Besides my camera zooming in and out the entire time.
Uh, no. I hope everybody is well and is feeling okay, and that the spike in numbers is serving as a bit of a reality check for people. If it's not, wear a mask, try to avoid going out as you're able, and look out for yourself and your community, and try to uh, hang in there until vaccine relief comes. Once one side has emerged victorious from the vaccine wars.
The great vaccine wars of 2020.
We need to get like a Fox News. We need to get like the Fox News banners that they had during Operation Iraqi Freedom, where it like has but it's the vaccine wars.
Yeah, absolutely.
That would be so much fun.
We could also make up things like today, Pfizer sent hitmen into the facilities.
Just, I'm about like.
Can we do white papers for Moderna? Like like Moderna is the evil Iraqi government that's building weapons of mass destruction.
I love it.
You know what we could do? We could take like all of the anti-vaxxer
we do it with the war on Christmas too.
Huh? We can also talk about the war on Christmas.
Well, I'm interested how that's going to get spun, considering that Melania hates Christmas and we know it now.
So, I was in a situation where a friend of mine was playing Christmas music and talking about Christmas already. And I was like, this is not allowed until after Thanksgiving. And they look me in the eyes and go, you can leave. And I was like, it's the best response I've ever heard to that criticism, honestly. You can leave.
I'm not a big Christmas before Thanksgiving person. That said, I respect people who like it. And I think that like it's an entirely defensible position that if Christmas music and stuff makes you happy, that you get
Well, what about the completely indefensibility of Thanksgiving as a process?
Well, Thanksgiving is fucking horrible. Let's get real.
Hey, y'all. I'm going to give y'all a hint. The Indians did not come to the table nicely and eat corn and turkey.
Yeah.
That's not what happened.
Let's stop lying to each other about Thanksgiving. It's a holiday celebrating genocide. Like, there were smallpox blankets distributed. And,
it only happened after a 6-year war in which large portions of the population of the Indian tribes that were involved were wiped out, and that they were told that if they didn't come, they would wipe out their villages. But, why would we teach you the actual histories of the American Empire when we could teach you the fun ones?
Also, if we're going to talk about the history, we should probably talk about who wrote Indigenous Peoples' History of the United States. Do you remember?
Not. But
that is a fantastic book, as is Howard Zinn's classic, the People's History of the United States. Both of those are good books.
It was Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz.
Oh, okay.
An Indigenous People's History of the United States.
Those are both wonderful books.
But we will talk about public policy and public advocacy. I'm going to leave y'all all with the following. I have a dog. His name's Dexter. He is a friend of the podcast. He's the first viewer. The reason he's the first viewer is because he was here when the first podcast happened, and he was here from the beginning to the end. Granted, he was largely like he is right there, sleeping, just on the floor instead of on the chair. So Dexter is friend of the podcast. He is adorable. Doggy.
All right.
Any animals, Eric, that you would like to introduce to the podcast?
None in the house. You can hear my dog barking in the background, though. Maybe sometime I'll do.
Very upset about not being included in the podcast.
Oh, I know. He's horribly upset. Maybe someday I'll do it. I'll stream outside and
with the dog.
Yeah, y'all can watch his antics.
Which also y'all should notice that when you fight for freedom and justice and love of your society, you own dogs, not cats.
I really want a cat, though.
God, why do you have whenever?
Because cats are cute and snuggly. All right, we went way off the rails with this ending, but this was a good second episode.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for the second episode and the first officially viewable episode of our podcast. Have a great day, everybody. Bye. I got to turn it off, though, and I haven't done that.